Halo, Shattered Resolve, a fanfiction Halo story by Elusive Vector. Prologue. Location, planetary surface, Colo, Equinox system. Date, February 5th, 2549. The low rumble of the Pelican faded as it flew toward the horizon, disappearing into Colo's rapidly darkening sky. 3 Spartans dispersed into a wide formation, kneeling on the outer perimeter of the drop zone to scan for Covenant forces. Tall trees resembling dead pines surrounded the clearing, obscuring their position. The Pelican's engines had caused a large amount of the dry dirt ground to go airborne. If it weren't for the cover of darkness, the dust cloud would have given away their position. Eva, designation S033, made a mental note of the tactical oversight and opened her team's communication channel.
Echo team, on me,
she directed. Her squad mates Raj and Sebastian flicked their indicator lights green before shuffling toward her in a crouched position. The squad formed a tightly grouped triangle, backs facing inward.
The target is 5 miles southwest.
Eva pointed with 2 fingers to their left.
Seb, that ridge stays parallel to us the whole way. I need you on overwatch.
She was confident that all 3 of them could easily snipe a Sangheili from over a mile away. But Sebastian, he was always better under pressure.
Copy that. Guess that means you and Raj get to have all the fun.
Sebastian tipped his helmet, pivoted, then jogged in the direction of the ridge. She lost sight of him in less than 2 seconds. His movement was quiet despite the almost 800 pounds of Mjolnir he was encased in. Eva turned her attention to the north where Raj remained, knelt at her side.
"We're gonna be hoofing it for a while, huh?"
he said, letting out a sigh. 5 miles wasn't far for a Spartan. He just wanted to lighten the mood.
"Lead the way, Cap."
Slowly raising her hand, Eva signaled to Raj. The 2 rose and began moving, guided by navigational markers on their heads-up displays. As the pair progressed, the wide-open clearing shrank into narrow pathways. Small, leafless trees only a couple of feet apart accented ones much larger, with a thick fog settled between them. A brisk walk was as fast as they could move in a place like this. 10 years earlier, the Covenant had found and invaded Colo. After quelling all human resistance, the Covenant fleet used orbital plasma beams to glass the world, leaving a lifeless surface soaked in radiation. In the years after, the Covenant decided it would be an ideal location for a supply and communications outpost. Colo belonged to them now.
"Ground's starting to soften."
Raj crouched and pressed the dirt with his gloved fingertips.
"We aren't supposed to be anywhere near that lake you mentioned in our briefing."
We're not.
Eva pushed down with her right leg, causing her Mjolnir's boot to compress the damp ground beneath it. Satellite imagery and geological analysis conducted by the Office of Naval Intelligence indicated that the planet had a shallow crust. Once the Covenant's glassing beams reached the surface, they superheated the underground rivers that powered Colo's human colony. The intense pressure forced the water through the crust, creating geysers that appeared without warning. Geysers that eventually formed highly toxic and corrosive lakes.
Heads up, Covenant patrol heading north. They came out of nowhere.
Sebastian peeked through the scope on his rifle. Its thermal camera gave him clear silhouettes of the aliens.
Approximately 23 seconds till contact.
Raj and Eva started searching for viable cover. They couldn't risk being exposed this early into the mission. Eva remembered passing a series of boulders at the base of the ridge, but there was no time. Right now, the only protection the Spartans had was the fog that surrounded them. Raj whispered sharply,
"Hit the deck,"
before catching his weight inches above the ground. Eva knelt behind a tree, her gray armor partially exposed.
Contacts. Elite Captain, Jackal, and 2 grunts. Standard patrol squad.
Sebastian centered the reticle of his scope on the torso of the Sangheili captain.
Just say the word.
Eva flashed her indicator light orange, ordering Sebastian to hold fire.
"Oh, come on. You don't think we can take him?"
Sebastian said, shifting his reticle to line up a 2-for-1 shot on the Ungoi. Given the Sangheili's proximity to Eva, he decided the smaller pair of aliens were a better use of his armor-piercing sabot round. Raj watched the Sangheili walk straight for Eva, head bobbing as if it were onto her scent. She held her cover, letting the Sangheili get inches away. Raj slowly shifted into a push-up position, knowing what she had planned. Eva leapt out of concealment, unsheathing her combat knife and sending it on a rapid trajectory toward the Sangheili's breastplate. The alien had no chance to react. Her titanium blade slid cleanly into its armor, piercing deep into its chest. Raj immediately sprang up and grabbed the Kigyar, wrapping his forearms around its neck. The alien squirmed through purple mist that sprayed out of the two Ungoi, then let out a muffled screech as Raj crushed its airway. Raj looked at the two dead Ungoi in front of him.
Nice shot, Seb.
I aim to please.
Sebastian responded, swinging his rifle up to sweep the area.
Everything looks clear, but it's hard to tell with only thermal.
Eva sheathed her knife and knelt to retrieve her modified battle rifle. For certain occasions, Oni issued specialized versions of UNSC weaponry to their squad. In this case, 2 suppressed BR-75 battle rifles and a suppressed SRS-99 AM sniper with upgraded optics. It would keep them under the radar while they crept through enemy territory.
We're a mile from target. Let's move in and get a closer look.
She turned and looked to the ridge.
Seb, regroup.
Sebastian gave a green indicator light and started down the ridge into the fog below. Eva began walking until she felt a sense of unease, followed by a low rumble that caused the trees to vibrate.
Sebastian, get here now. We've got to move.
A garbled, static response followed. Raj glanced at the integrated Geiger counter displayed on his HUD.
Got a radiation spike. Likely what's messing with our
Suddenly, a violent, boiling hot explosion of corrosive water and steam broke the ground beneath them. The vicious water column sent the 2 Spartans flying into the air. Eva impacted a tree, broke through its deadened trunk, and smacked squarely into a jagged rock. The percussive noise of the event reverberated through the forest, settling into a steady sound, like that of a waterfall. Stunned and disoriented, Eva propped herself up and looked around. She couldn't see anything through the fog.
Echo team, status.
Her voice strained, and there was no response. Chapter 1. Location. Coordinates redacted. Office of Naval Intelligence, Space Station, Sol System. Date, June 8th, 2555.
Just a few minor adjustments and you'll be on your way, ma'am.
It wasn't the armor she was accustomed to, but Eva was glad to be back in a set of Mjolnir. The past few days she spent walking the halls of the station in BDUs had felt like an eternity. A short break didn't bother her, but a Spartan's purpose was action, and without Mjolnir, they weren't sending her anywhere. When the call came through for Eva to get fitted into a new set of Mjolnir, she felt conflicted. After spending the past few years in her Mark VI armor, it had become a source of comfort and stability. It had become her home, a sanctuary in the chaos of war. Without it, Eva remained the peak of human strength, agility, and cunning. But even still, she felt exposed. If not for her rank, she was sure troopers would make jabs about her shaved head, scars, and unusually large stature as she passed. But the mythos of the Spartans overshadowed the nuances of superficial acceptance, and Eva had Spartan written all over her face. After 2 thorough evaluations of Eva's Mark VI armor, the microfusion cell was deemed too costly to repair. This initiated the decommissioning process through Oni's primary arms manufacturer, Materials Group. They were the private company responsible for sorting out the usable components, exporting sensitive data, and reducing irredeemable parts into raw material. It wasn't the fate that she thought the armor deserved, but that wasn't for her to decide.
Sensor arrays operational check, servos active check, shield module, looks functional.
The UNSC engineer, Corporal Fenner Stokes, pressed a sequence of buttons on his datapad, released the clamps on the broker armor mechanism used to mount Mjolnir-powered assault armor to a Spartan's bodysuit. The multi-axis assembly made a series of twists and whirs as Eva stepped out onto the platform.
All right, Captain, you're all set. How does she feel?
Corporal Stokes looked up into Eva's iridescent green helmet visor, only to see his own reflection staring back.
Light. Feels like it's made of foam.
Eva slowly lifted her hands, twisting them to inspect her gray, armor-clad forearms. The nano-composite bodysuit of the Mjolnir Mark VII came equipped with additional layers of adaptive titanium weave fabric. This, combined with microscopic channels for liquid pass-through, allowed for higher efficacy in temperature regulation superior to the Mark VI. It almost felt as if there were no suit at all. Stokes wrapped the armor on her bicep.
High-purity titanium alloy with high-load brushless actuators. It's lighter, stronger, fast. Hell, it's better in just about every way to that old clunker you brought in here.
Old clunker.
Eva thought to herself. It looked worse for wear, but the Mark VI was hardly 3 years old. With its upgrades, some including highly classified and still unreleased technologies, she could have run circles around any Spartan wearing Mark VII. Increasingly rapid advancements in technology meant Spartans frequently had the opportunity to change to newer iterations of Mjolnir. In similar cases to Eva, some were forced to. She was curious about the potential to retrofit components of her Mark VI to the modern platform. Doing so would help in making her transition to the new suit a bit less jarring. The UNSC, ONI, and Materials Group all agreed that decommissioning a suit before it malfunctions was the best course of action. Doing so increased the likelihood that aspects of the technology could be refurbished for use elsewhere. It was all about reducing costs for the UNSC and its partners. Mjolnir isn't cheap. The repurposing of her Mark VI was a hopeful prospect, unlikely as it was. Odds were, the armor would be stripped and broken down into raw material. Ava's train of thought was quickly interrupted as a stocky, middle-aged man in olive fatigues barged into the doorway. Lieutenant Gerald Dahlgren was the first person to make contact with Eva upon her return into UNSC space. Dahlgren was leading a Marine squad on a routine patrol when they stumbled upon her scuttled ship just over a month ago. When he called it in to FleetCom, he was ordered to immediately take the Spartan to an ONI facility for debriefing. The nearest facility was a week's worth of slipspace travel away. Plenty of time for he and Eva to exchange war stories.
Captain, your presence has been requested in the command center.
The slow, calm voice Eva remembered was replaced with a rushed tone.
Understood.
Eva nodded at Corporal Stokes and headed toward the hall, pausing at Dahlgren.
Everything all right?
The Vice Admiral told me to keep it hush. Said you'd be informed when you arrived.
His whisper carried down to both ends of the hall, turning heads and opening ears. It was clear that the lieutenant didn't quite understand the Admiral's order, or he simply didn't care. He looked to Eva.
Probably shouldn't keep him waiting.
As the two strode the halls of the station to the command center, Eva couldn't help but notice that many of the station's crew members paid little attention to her. A few gave modest nods as she passed, but most offered little more than a glance. The proliferation of the Spartan 4 program made it more common for military facilities, especially those run by ONI, to house Spartan fire teams. In this place, it wasn't uncommon to cross paths with a super soldier. Eva welcomed the change. She was never one for theatrics.
Once we're in there, I'm shutting my mouth. I may have properly pissed off the Admiral earlier.
Dahlgren didn't elaborate, and his scowl deterred Eva from inquiring further. She wondered what the lieutenant did to anger the Admiral, but she wasn't surprised. He was easily upset. The pair reached the large steel double door of the command center. Dahlgren extended his arm, blocking Eva's path.
Look, a lot has changed since first contact on Harvest, but there's a lot that hasn't. Just know I don't agree with this.
Dahlgren wished he could look into Eva's eyes. He could infer a lot of what someone was thinking that way, but he hadn't seen her face since they met, and he never would.
Loud and clear.
Eva gave the lieutenant a subtle nod as the door parted in front of them. Eva stepped into the command center, stood at attention, and saluted Vice Admiral Malachi Long.
Admiral, sir.
Even though he was a prick, she still needed to show him a modicum of respect. A decorated servant of the UNSC, he had contributed to many victories throughout the Human Covenant War. Dahlgren echoed Eva's behavior, though with much less enthusiasm. The Admiral then stepped forward, closer to the hollow table that sat between them.
Captain, you're late. How disappointing.
Long was the type to seize the upper hand quickly in any interaction, on or off the battlefield. It was a trait that likely helped him secure such a prestigious position, working alongside ONI on multiple classified initiatives. Ava always had a distaste for politics among high-ranking military officials. She chose not to engage, instead letting her actions speak for her. It was a noble trait that many of the Spartan twos shared. They were soldiers, first and foremost, and egos led to clouded judgment on the battlefield. The room fell silent for a noticeable beat.
You've been reassigned, Spartan. Damn insurrectionists are exchanging pleasantries with the Covenant at an old fuel refinery of theirs.
Covenant, sir?
Over the past 4 months, Ava had been on a solo assignment to the Kigyar homeworld of Chuo. Her mission was simple: collect information about the Kigyar leadership. The collapse of the Covenant in 2552 put the formerly allied alien species into a power frenzy, and Oni wanted eyes on all of it. Based on what she witnessed on Chuo, Ava was under the impression that the Covenant dissolved entirely. The Kigyar leadership didn't so much as mention their former religious alliance. They seemed to have more pressing matters. The Admiral looked to Eva and squinted.
I don't know what you've been told, Captain, but the Covenant is far from gone.
The Admiral handed Eva a data pad, the screen displaying a series of red dots covering what looked to be planetary bodies.
There are more than a handful of loyalist Covenant remnants scattered throughout the outer colonies.
Long pointed his finger at Eva before turning to look out of the panoramic window behind him.
Now they're communicating with the Innies, and nothing good can come from that.
Eva's eyes scanned the datapad. Though she was a highly valuable Oni asset, she wasn't privy to the plethora of intelligence at their disposal. It made sense to her that a dogmatic group, such as the Covenant, would continue to act on the will of the long-dead prophets. But at this scale, working with human enemies of the UNSC was the only feasible way. She caught the stone-cold stare of Dahlgren, who was visibly upset with the content of the conversation. Ava's attention moved back to the datapad in her hand. Each of the planetary bodies on the display had coordinates designating their precise location. One was a slightly lighter color and was larger than the others. Ava quickly deduced that this planet would be the location of her next deployment.
I need you to infiltrate that refinery and figure out what they're up to.
Long took a pause to adjust his shirt cuff.
You'll be working with a Spartan detachment on this, Recon Alpha.
Ava's spine stiffened. She swallowed a few choice words before responding.
I work better alone.
The external speakers on her helmet gave her voice a slightly deeper, semi-artificial tone.
Tough shit,
barked the Admiral. He bent over slightly, placed his hands on the hollow table, and took a deep breath.
You Spartans are so entitled.
He didn't look up.
Lieutenant, do us all a favor and take the captain to meet her new fire team. You're both dismissed.
Chapter 2. Location. Coordinates redacted. Office of Naval Intelligence Space Station. Sol System. Date: June 8th, 2555. As she exited the command center, Eva lingered on the fact that she had been thrown back into the insurrection, the war with seemingly no end. Her immediate instinct was to mentally sort through the few remaining human colonies and label them as friend or foe. It had been a while, but she'd been in this situation before. At the onset of their creation, the Spartan II's sole purpose was to eliminate the insurrection. The UNSC and Oni wielded humanity's greatest weapon to suppress what they saw as its greatest threat. It wasn't until first contact with the Covenant on Harvest that an alternate use case for the Spartans emerged. Eva spent her adolescence executing covert operations. In her case, surveillance and assassination of key rebel leaders. It didn't bother her right away. Oni used highly effective indoctrination tactics that convinced them that they were doing the right thing. Though she remained steadfast in enforcing Oni's agenda, over time, Eva matured to understand that there were nuances to the conflict.
They're just surviving, the rebels.
Dahlgren fiddled with an object in his hand. It was about the size of a deck of cards and looked like it was made from junkyard scrap. He gripped it tightly and gestured at Eva.
And here you are not saying a damn thing about it. What you told me on the ship, was it all a lie?
During their journey through slipspace, Ava had alluded to her upbringing, or lack thereof, to Dahlgren. The details, such as her abduction at 5 years old, were highly classified. The only thing he knew was that she was conscripted into the Spartan II program. She decided to leave the rest of her history to his imagination.
I thought you were different.
He said, turning his head opposite to Ava. She didn't blame him. The Spartans were made public in 2547 to boost morale for the troops and general population. He and everyone else were sold on lies of moral justice, heroics, and stoicism. In reality, the Spartans did what they were created to do, follow orders, no matter how gray. The halls were void of any noise except for the low thud of Ava's footsteps. There was a palpable tension forming in the conversation. She quickly changed the subject.
What do you know about Recon Alpha?
Not much, just that they report directly to the Vice Admiral.
Dahlgren responded.
They're UNSC?
Ava thought to herself. She wondered how that may impact their mission. Simply being a Spartan wouldn't get her a free pass to camaraderie. She'd have to earn their respect. The sounds of spacecraft, gantries, and bustling crew got progressively louder as the two approached the hangar. When they reached the door, it slid open, revealing crates and containers stacked from floor to ceiling. Amongst them were weapons caches, aircraft, and ground transports with dozens of troopers moving between. It was enough firepower to annihilate the entirety of the insurrection, and Eva was sure Oni would like nothing more. But the war had become more politics than combat. With the fight for humanity's survival over, the attention had shifted back to its internal squabbles. As much as they wanted to, Oni couldn't simply exterminate the rebels. They knew that whoever had public favor gained a bit of an edge, especially in the outskirts of UNSC space. Eva's eyes scanned the hangar from the elevated platform until they landed on a pair of Spartans standing next to a black Pelican. They were sorting through weapons and equipment. Dahlgren continued clutching the junkyard scrap in his hand.
You can choose, you know that, right?
His gaze didn't falter from the object as he spoke. He looked up at Eva and continued.
Who are we to tell them what to do? The war is over, we should stay off their worlds and leave them alone.
Eva's brow furrowed under her helmet. She seldom found herself in discussions about the morality of war, always feeling that it would be hypocritical of a Spartan. She finally acknowledged the object in Dahlgren's hand, pointing to it.
What's that you're holding?
A refugee kid gave this to me on Leonis Minoris. Her and her family were running from the fighting on Mamori.
His thumb moved slowly across the object's metal face.
Didn't do him much good.
The fighting between the insurrection and UNSC continued during the Human Covenant War, albeit at a much smaller scale. The skirmishes pushed civilians out of their homes with nowhere to go. Most would make their way onto UNSC rescue fleets en route to other colonies. Many would be met with Covenant invasions after arriving at their destination, leaving one hellscape for another. Eva felt an unfamiliar instinct to console Dahlgren, but suppressed the action. She knew it wasn't right for anyone to reaffirm anti-UNSC sentiment, let alone a Spartan. That would be borderline treason. She glanced over at Bay 12 and noticed the Pelican's idle burners kick on.
I have to go, Lieutenant.
Her visor glimmered as she turned her head.
Be more careful about who you piss off.
You just be careful,
Dahlgren said.
Not many people to trust these days, but I probably don't need to remind you of that.
His face shifted to a frown as Eva turned to move down the staircase. The lieutenant walked forward and slowly placed his hands on the railing in front of him. He watched Eva as she walked to Bay 12. His eyes started to water.
Goodbye, Captain.
While approaching, Eva paid close attention to the two Spartans, analyzing as best she could. Going in blind with a new squad was a lot to ask. If it were up to her, she would have preferred extensive training to get acquainted. What were their strengths, their weaknesses and tendencies? In her mind, it was a recipe for disaster. Both of them wore brown Mark 7 Mjolnir with apparent upgrades and customizations. One had communications upgrades, a comms range extender, wrist-mounted audio controller, and an Echelon high-power BattleNet relay integrated into their helmet. The other wore a Gen 3 Trailblazer helmet, along with an emergency navigational transponder and additional storage packs for ammunition. They were the shorter of the two, but Eva knew better than to make conclusions based on appearance alone. The Spartans looked over their shoulder and noticed Eva approaching. They didn't acknowledge her beyond a nod, and didn't bother to salute their newly appointed squad leader. Eva did her best to present a relaxed demeanor. She wanted to make a good first impression despite the cold welcome. She certainly didn't want them to feel her unease going into the mission.
My name is Captain Eva 033. Glad to be among other Spartans again.
Eva had been exposed to lying plenty through her time with Oni, but it was a new feeling doing it herself. She hadn't worked with other Spartans since the later years of the Human Covenant War, not since Colo. She preferred to be on solo assignments, where she was only responsible for herself.
Ma'am.
The taller Spartan stepped forward and put out his hand.
Name's Ed Campbell, Chief Warrant Officer.
He pointed to the other Spartan.
That's Sarah Torres. She's a CWO as well. I assume the Vice Admiral briefed you?
Affirmative.
Eva responded, moving to inspect the Pelican's interior. Eva looked back to her squad mates.
Prepped for deployment. Let's mount up.
She noticed Sarah's helmet twitch.
Straight past the formalities and onto the mission. You Spartan 2s really are a no-bullshit bunch,
Sarah said as she walked onto the Pelican. Eva ignored the remark and looked to the now vacant entry platform where she left Dahlgren.
You just be careful.
His voice echoed in her head. The harsh white light of the hangar's overhead bulbs gradually narrowed as the Pelican's drop hatch closed. It made a loud series of mechanical thuds as it latched, followed by a hiss, signifying pressurization. Eva sat in one of the bench seats, but didn't bother to strap herself in. She felt a light jolt when the Pelican's forward thrusters kicked on. They flew slowly through the station's shielded bay door into the blackness of space. The spooling sound of the compact Shaw Fujikawa translite engine was calming to Eva. She looked to Ed, who sat with his elbows on his knees. He ticked a quick nod before opening the team comm channel.
Welcome to Recon Alpha.
Chapter 3. Location: Ixion, Lapith System. Date: June 10th, 2555.
Wake up! We're here!
Sarah leaned over and nudged Ed, whose chin was resting on his chest plate. He shook his head slightly as he gained consciousness.
Damn, about time,
he remarked, stroking the side of his helmet. He looked around the compartment before his eyes landed on Eva, who was sitting mostly still with her back straight and head forward. She had been awake for the entire 2-day journey through slipspace. She spent that time staring at her datapad, taking note of exposed areas and memorizing the potential routes from each landing zone. Better to be prepared. Eva set the datapad on the bench and stood up. She walked to the cockpit door and pressed a button that retracted it into the wall. As she stepped into the confined space, the pilot, Flight Officer Don Riley, turned to look over his shoulder. He reached over to the right side console and flipped a switch.
Command, this is Alpha 1. We've made it to Ixion's L2 orbit. Stand by for updates.
Riley flipped the switch back to its original position and looked at Eva.
Ma'am?
Sitrep, please, officer.
Eva moved closer and placed her hand on the headrest of the pilot's chair.
Are we ready for insertion?
Riley nodded and gave the console closest to him a generous pat.
So far it looks like we've made it undetected. This stealth tech works wonders.
Eva pointed to Ixion, most of which they could see through the windshield of the Pelican. Its atmosphere glowed light blue, giving it an ethereal presence.
Let's move to low orbit and assess our drop zones,
Eva said.
We've got a timeline to adhere to.
Riley affirmed the order and turned on the ship's engines, replacing silence with the low humming of a Pelican operating in the vacuum of space. Eva stepped into the main compartment, where her squad mates remained seated. Their body language reminded her of a pair of bored recruits waiting for a turn at the firing range. Whether she liked it or not, she was the leader of this squad. She kicked herself to start acting like it.
On your feet,
Eva said firmly.
I won't say it again.
It was enough of a shift in tone to raise the heat and force Ed and Sarah to stand up and stiffen their posture. They didn't seem at all enthused about the mission, but there was a job to do, no matter how inconsequential they perceived it to be.
This mission may not be exciting, but its importance cannot be understated.
Eva began to walk slowly from one end of the compartment to the other.
If the rebels ally with what's left of the Covenant, they could gain an edge on the inner colonies.
She continued,
You don't know me, but I need you both to trust me through this.
The young Spartans exchanged a glance before Ed responded.
We know Oni and we know how you spooks operate. We look after each other in Recon Alpha.
I'm a Spartan, just like you.
Ava rebuked.
I leave the double-crossing to the bureaucrats and top brass. My only priorities are my team and the mission.
She wasn't surprised by their opinions. Oni was a shady organization that ran even shadier operations. It was no secret that those within Oni would not and have not hesitated to sacrifice others to retain their influence. Sarah scoffed.
We'll believe it when we see it.
So far, the mission wasn't going as Eva had hoped. Her leadership skills had atrophied. Being alone for so long didn't do her any favors. She was taken back by their resistance. It wasn't Spartan behavior.
Are they Spartans?
Ava thought. Flight Officer Riley's voice came through their team comm channel.
Scanners are detecting short radio bursts near LZ-1. Likely some any comms chatter. Should I get closer so we can take a listen?
Negative. Proceed to the next available landing zone,
Ava said before grasping the nearest strap hanger for support. Riley confirmed.
Copy that. On approach to LZ-3.
The Pelican momentarily shook, triggering a Pavlovian response in Eva to begin deployment preparations. She walked aft to the recessed weapons rack on the ship's wall and retrieved a suppressed M392 Designated Marksman Rifle, or DMR. She turned around to see Ed and Sarah following suit.
Captain,
Riley spoke again.
Can't seem to reach command. Can you confirm a communications dead zone?
Eva glanced at the communications icon in her HUD. It opened a short list of channels, then quickly collapsed when she made her selection.
Command, this is Recon Alpha. Acknowledge.
Ava failed to sparse any stray words from the static. She pointed to Ed, who was fiddling with the optics of his DMR.
Could you try using your BattleNet relay to contact Command? We'll proceed with our mission, but they need visibility.
She hoped that posing it as a question would soften the order. Ed didn't respond. Instead, he clicked a few buttons on his helmet's relay.
Vice Admiral, this is Recon Alpha. Do you copy?
Ed gave a thumbs up and switched off his helmet's external speakers. After a few moments, he turned back to Eva.
All good. The Vice Admiral is aware of our status.
The glowing red bulb next to the cockpit door changed to green as the sound of depressurization flooded the compartment. The drop hatch opened, revealing the planet's lush surface below. The Spartans hadn't heard much about Ixion outside of a few small skirmishes, but they knew that the independent colony had made it through the entirety of the Human Covenant War without a scratch. They knew that until recently, Ixion's inhabitants hadn't made any contact with the aliens. It was unsurprising, then, that the planet's surface was pristine and plentiful. Evergreen trees and shrubs of varying sizes covered the landscape with snow-capped mountains separating the tree line from the sky above. The soft, golden glow of Ixion's star amplified the picturesque scene as it began its descent beyond the horizon. Eva had never been to Earth, but she thought Ixion looked a lot like the pictures she'd seen of humanity's home. The passing trees shifted into a blurry mass of warm green as the Pelican made its descent. Eva felt it slow down just before a notice appeared on her HUD. Approaching LZ-3.
Insertion on my mark.
Riley announced.
3, 2, 1.
The Pelican briefly paused, hovering a few meters from the ground.
Mark!
Each Spartan dropped out of the ship with a powerful thud and moved quickly into the dense forest. Riley's static voice came through again.
Recon Alpha deployed, moving to low orbit to await orders. Oh, good luck, Spartans.
Ava took a moment to orient herself, then decided on a route eastward. It wasn't a straight line to the target, but it was a safe approach that kept space between them and the rebels. Before she could say anything, Sarah chimed in.
We ought to move north to the peak of that hill. We'll have eyes on their meeting and tactical advantage.
She was right about the geography. It would provide an easy extraction point and great visibility. What she didn't seem to understand were the nuances of working in a communications dead zone. Eva stepped closer to her.
Ed's relay works for comms, but they're throttling the range of his audio recorder with their jammers.
She pointed east.
We're going to have to move in close to get what we came for.
There was an awkwardly long pause before Ed nodded and walked in Eva's direction, Sarah following short behind. Their reluctance was palpable, but at least they weren't pushing back. They snaked through the brush until stumbling upon a dirt road. Eva put her arm at a 90-degree angle and clinched her fist.
Why are we stopping?
Ed asked. Eva gestured with her rifle.
This road wasn't on any of the maps.
And you want to follow it?
Sarah said assumptively. Before she could respond, Ava caught a faint glare in her peripheral. She had enough experience to realize that it was a vehicle barreling straight toward them. The trio retreated into the brush to avoid contact. The vehicle blew past them in a blur of electric blue and magenta. It moved at a fast clip, but the radiance of plasma and absence of wheels gave away its origin.
That was a Spectre,
Ava said. Sarah perked up.
With innies at the controls. This just got a lot more interesting.
Ava shrugged as if she were adjusting her armor.
We'll check out where the road leads later, after we see who's buying tanks from the Covenant.
The 3 Spartans crossed the road and walked 5 kilometers through the thick vegetation. The sun had disappeared, but the night vision integrated into their helmets allowed them to maintain a hurried and consistent pace. The familiar folly of military life gradually faded into existence. Innie or not, it all had the same sound. Ava looked up, barely able to make out the texture of concrete walls through the forest canopy.
We're here.
Ava looked at her HUD.
Approximately 5 minutes. Keep an eye out for a scrap heap of a ship. That'll be the Kig Yar.
I can't see shit with this wall here,
Ed muttered.
How are we supposed to identify a ship?
Ava sounded disappointed.
We're going to have to infiltrate this compound. It's the only way to get close enough to—
Sarah interrupted.
There's no intel on it. We have no idea what's behind these walls.
Or outside of them,
Ed added.
Of course there's no intel.
Ava leaned in closer to Sarah.
We are the intel.
Ava tapped the side of her helmet with 2 fingers.
We're comms silent starting now.
She made a quick gesture with her hand, giving them an order to stay close and move out. They hugged the compound's walls, maneuvering around its perimeter until Eva noticed a gap in the security spotlights scanning overhead. She looked at Sarah and Ed, then pointed upward at the top of the wall. It couldn't have been taller than 6 meters, hardly an obstacle for a Spartan. Ed stepped away from the wall, then sprinted straight toward it. He ran up for a few meters and launched into the air and grabbed the steel coping lip that lined the top. After a pause, he vaulted over, vanishing from Eva's sight. Sarah went next. Eva followed. Supply crates littered the wall's walkway and obstructed sight lines from the interior of the compound. The 3 Spartans knelt for a moment to assess their options. Eva noticed a guard tower to their left. She motioned an order and started towards it. In a matter of seconds, the squad reached the tower's entrance, pausing briefly to scan for hostiles. Ed stepped to the door and placed a small electric device on the entry pad. After a brief buzz and spark, the door slid open. One by one, the Spartans stepped into the tower, rifles up and fingers on their triggers. They moved in silence, rapidly clearing each room, corner, and behind the stairway that circled the interior. Ava looked up through the center of the stairway and saw a shadow move across the ceiling. She flicked her indicator light orange and hurried for the staircase, moving as fast and silent as she could. At the top of the staircase, Ava was met with the sight of a man with his back turned to her. He was swaying slightly and looking out the window. She caught a glimmer in the corner of her eye and noticed a large brown bottle sitting next to his foot. Likely the cause of his pitiful spatial awareness. A bright white light suddenly appeared and shone through the window, bouncing left, then right. Ed spoke quietly through the team comm channel.
I know we're supposed to be comm silent, but that Jackal ship just arrived.
Eva had to make a decision. Take her chances finding another vantage point, or take this one by force. She leapt into the room and dashed toward the guard. He began to turn around, oblivious to the mass of metal and bone hurling toward him. His body crumbled, falling to the floor after a swift elbow to the head. Ava flicked her indicator light green, looked out the window, and began recording her helmet's video feed. By the time she was situated, the Kig Yar dropship had landed and its occupants disembarked. The meeting had already begun.
Audio recorder,
she snapped.
Way ahead of you,
Ed responded, crouched in a small area with a balcony, a stone's throw from the watchtower.
Transmitting,
he said, pointing his wrist-mounted audio recorder at the targets.
And what the hell am I supposed to do with this?
A human that looked to be in his mid-40s put his arms in the air and stepped forward. His appearance reminded Ava of a pirate or mercenary. Either career would explain his swaggered gait and deep wrinkles. His displeasure for the Kig Yar was evident.
I'm not paying for a bunch of beat-up old UEG garbage. I need alien weapons. What are you not understanding?
To Eva's surprise, the Kig-Yar hadn't interrupted the man's tirade. It just stood there, arms crossed as if waiting for him to get tired.
We get you alien weapons,
the Kig-Yar said.
but price triple for our troubles.
The human grew even angrier.
What do you mean, triple?
After Covenant collapse, harder to find salvageable Covenant technology,
said the Kig-Yar.
What are you not understanding, Fitch?
Fitch.
Ava thought. Aboard the rescue vessel that found Eva, she and Dahlgren discussed their lives, the war, and their friends. In hindsight, Ava noticed a recurring character in Dahlgren's stories, Corporal Sherwin Fitch.
Fine.
The human leaned forward and pointed.
You've got 3 days. Any later and the price is cut in half. The calendar I gave you, you're using it?
The Kig-Yar bobbed its head up and down.
Yes, 3 days, yes.
Ava stepped back from the window.
We've got what we need. Let's get out of here.
That was all a bit too easy, no?
Sarah questioned. Eva agreed. It was too easy. There were hardly any personnel guarding what was supposed to be a vital location. It seemed the rebels had been struggling more than Oni realized, or it was a diversion. The Spartans jumped from the wall, crashing through trees as they fell. The moment their boots touched ground, they sprinted in the direction from which they came.
We'll investigate where that specter went.
Ava placed her words between breaths.
But first, connect me with the Vice Admiral.
Ed worked to press the correct inputs on his helmet while maintaining a 50-kilometer-per-hour sprint.
Got him. Patching you through.
Yes, Captain?
Long asked.
Did you find out what those innie bastards are trading with the Jackals?
Affirmative. The rebels are asking the Jackals for Covenant weapons.
Eva paused to allow the Vice Admiral to interject. When he didn't, she continued.
Seems like they're planning something big. Acknowledge?
The silence continued for a few more seconds.
Ed, run relay diagnostics.
Relay is working just fine.
He glanced at his HUD.
Says here the station seized transmission and the link to ComSat is gone.
Ava felt a chill run up her spine. In her line of work, reliable communication was hard to come by. But this felt different.
We'll have to brief him at the station.
Ava motioned with her arm.
Let's move.
Chapter 4. Location. Coordinates redacted. Office of Naval Intelligence Space Station. Sol System. Date. June 10th, 2555. Dread consumed Dahlgren after Eva's departure. Another fight. Another war. It's why she and the other Spartans were created. He reached into his pocket and retrieved an olive-green fabric square.
But this war, it isn't the same. It's not so black and white,
he thought. He dried his eyes and started down the hall, head hung low. He was exhausted, frustrated, and ready to get the hell away from Oni. A passerby may have attributed his emotion to Ava's departure, but it wasn't that she left. It was what she was leaving to do.
Humans. They're humans, not the Covenant.
His internal dialogue continued.
How can we be so quick to fight each other again? Resources? Power?
Strategic advantage.
Ava's voice rang in Dahlgren's head. That excuse, paired with the promise of protection, is the propaganda that the UNSC spouted to the public. As much as he tried, he couldn't shake his thoughts from arising.
You ignored them during the war. You let the Covenant slaughter them, glass them, so ignore them now. Is that so hard?
The sound of overlapping conversations and squealing chairs interrupted his internal strife. He approached the mess hall and stood at the entryway, stopping for a moment to look around. There was a wide range of men and women, soldiers and not, some originating from the outer colonies. He wondered if any of them had familial ties to the rebels. Did they know what the UNSC planned to do now that the aliens weren't a threat? The savory smell of searing meat and garlic wafted into Dahlgren's nose. Oni always got the fancy stuff, the same kind of thing you'd see at a decent restaurant back home. It reminded him of a simpler time before joining the UNSC, albeit one with much lower chances of survival. At least back then, he wasn't aware of their ever-growing list of sins. While stepping away, Dahlgren's eye caught a glimpse of the armory, door wide open. He looked left, then right. Not a single guard. He shook his head, turned toward the barracks, and began walking. After another stretch of hallway, he arrived at a small steel door, painted olive green with a number stenciled in white on the corner. After scanning his personnel badge, the door opened, revealing a small gray room with a twin bed, metal sink, and a large screen mounted on the wall. He stepped inside and immediately plopped onto the bed. For a while, he stared at the blank ceiling, wondering if he'd ever be able to truly relax again. His mind drifted to his past, and he began comparing how he was feeling then with how he felt now. When word of aliens reached his home of New Harmony, Dahlgren was barely holding it together. He had just lost the only relative he had, his uncle, 3 days before they invaded Harvest. At the ripe age of 20, he decided to take out his anger and grief on a personal scapegoat, the Covenant. But at that time, he was on the outside, looking in. This was the first time he'd be on the ground floor of a budding conflict, actively participating in its rise. His mind snapped back to reality, and questions began popping in. How can he continue to serve in the UNSC? Should he speak out against them?
No.
Dahlgren thought.
If I do that, I'll just be another defector. Another innie like Fitch.
He reached into his flak jacket and pulled out a folded paper, its surface wrinkled and stained. Most of the time it remained tucked away close to his chest, and it had been almost a year since he last read it. The paper crinkled as he unfolded it. The words were faint, but still holding on to legibility.
Gerald, I'm sorry. After our conversations the past few days, I bet you're not surprised. But I couldn't stand by any longer. I'm leaving the Corps for good. All those years we were deployed together. All of the fighting, bloodshed, and friends lost. I've learned a lot about myself, but I've learned even more about everyone else. The UNSC is a cesspool of righteous egomaniacs who prioritize their own safety above that of the innocents. We were fooled, sold on lies of saving humanity from the Covenant, and I've come to realize that the reality is much bleaker. You saw what they did on Memore, all those refugees shipped off to their deaths. No more. I can't tell you where I'm going, but I can tell you this. I'm joining the rebels. They aren't our enemy. They're the families, brothers, sisters, and mothers that the UNSC shunned while they cradled their precious inner colonies. I know they could wipe us off the map, kill us all. But I also know that sometimes it's better to lose doing the right thing. Are you prepared to lose? Sherwin Fitch.
Dahlgren pressed his eyes shut, sending a tear along the bridge of his nose. A fury of thoughts raced through his head. One stuck out, repeating every couple of heartbeats.
Am I prepared to lose?
He sprang up, bent over the sink, and splashed cold water onto his face. Bloodshot eyes stared back at him in the mirror. He hadn't gotten a good night's sleep in days, and his mind was beginning to falter. The rectangular black void on the wall lit up bright blue with a line of text displayed. Incoming message. He pressed the corner of the screen. Lieutenant Gerald Dahlgren, report to Vice Admiral Long's office, ASAP. Dahlgren's face instinctively snarled at the mention of the Vice Admiral. He'd only just met the guy when he arrived at the station, but it didn't take long for Dahlgren to realize that he was the embodiment of everything wrong with the UNSC. He neatly folded Fitch's letter and tucked it into his flak before making the short walk to Long's quarters.
I wonder what this is about,
he thought.
Finally getting shipped out of here, I hope.
As he approached the office, Dahlgren saw a number of Marines huddled at the entrance. Their body language was rigid and orderly. When he got closer, members of the group glanced up at him with stone-cold stares. At that moment, Dahlgren noticed that one of them held a neural inhibitor collar, devices used to paralyze dangerous prisoners. He froze, stopping a couple of meters away from the Marines.
Gentlemen, what's this about?
He said, trying to sound casual. The front man of the group stepped forward a pace.
Sir, the Vice Admiral would like you to come with us.
His voice shifted to a slightly higher, friendlier pitch.
Why don't you step over here so we can get this inhib on you?
Dahlgren's heart began to race. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he shouldn't stick around to find out. He took off, running down the hall, adrenaline pumping.
Did Ava sell me out?
He thought.
I'm such an idiot.
He turned left, then right, avoiding Marines trying to cut him off at the end of each corridor. His options were diminishing fast as he barged into the mess hall's entrance. A group of workers looked up from their meal to stare at the sweaty, panicking lieutenant.
Hey, buddy, you all right?
One of them asked. Dahlgren attempted to respond between labored breaths.
No.
He looked around and saw Marines blocking each of the exits.
Except...
He turned around and looked to the armory, then let out a sigh of relief. The door was still open. Before he could process the decision, he sprinted in and closed the door. He pulled the combat knife from his boot and pried open the door control panel. Once opened, he reached in, grabbed a bundle of wires and ripped them from their connections. The door was jammed. He took a moment to think.
What the hell am I doing? They haven't tripped the alarm, which means they're trying to keep this quiet.
He fiddled with his knife.
Maybe I'm overreacting.
A stern voice came over the armory intercom. Right away, Dahlgren identified the snap-cold voice of Vice Admiral Long.
Lieutenant, you're only making this worse for yourself,
he said.
Come out of the armory so that we can clear the air.
Dahlgren sat in silence for over a minute, searching for something to say. He frantically paced up and down the rows of weaponry and noted an abundance of C7 explosives sitting neatly in a crate.
I don't even know what's going on,
Dahlgren pleaded.
Don't give me that bull, soldier. You know good and well Oni has ears everywhere. Despite the captain so kindly turning off her recorder, the station's AI was able to hear your entire conversation.
Dahlgren froze. He had known that, but he let his guard down with Eva. Her presence brought an air of security to him. At least it did, for a time. He looked back again at the stack of C7. Committing treason was a capital offense, the penalty of which was a permanent induced coma. Some lucky souls even had their pseudo-execution broadcast on United Earth government channels. At least some of the families got closure that way. Dahlgren didn't have family, nothing to live for beyond his beliefs. He retrieved the note from his flak jacket, but kept it folded in his palm.
If you don't come out in the next 30 seconds, we're pulling you out,
the Vice Admiral yelled. Dahlgren reached into the crate and grabbed a primed C7 explosive stack. Having weaponry available at the drop of a hat was wise when aliens appeared like rogue waves. But with the war over, it became an occupational hazard. Old habits die hard. Sparks sprayed from a pinprick in the armory's door. With torches, they'd cut through that door within a minute. Dahlgren made 3 deliberate inputs on the explosive's controls. It began to chirp as he carefully placed it back with the others. He looked to the door and saw the cut panel begin to vibrate. They were almost through, but they were too slow. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tears rolled down his face as he clutched the letter.
I know now,
he whispered,
that I am prepared to lose.
A brief flash of blinding light engulfed the room, followed by an enormous boom that reverberated through the station. Chunks of shrapnel tore through the walls and into vital equipment attached to the exterior of the station. Support structures twisted, rupturing under the tremendous force while fiery tendrils licked the outer hull. The sirens blared as the station's AI initiated lockdown protocols and sealed all compromised areas. Noise and chaos flooded the station. The area where Dahlgren stood was suddenly a still void, perfectly silent, almost serene. Chapter 5. Location: Ixion, Lapith System. Date: June 10th. 25:55.
It can't be much further.
Eva looked over her shoulder at Ed and Sarah, who were following close behind.
My sensors are picking up trace radiation, confirm.
It's weak, but it's there,
Ed responded.
There's definitely plasma emitters nearby.
They continued on their path, moving at a steady pace parallel to the dirt road. The night was calm, but teeming with life. Insects buzzed and animals howled, while their Mjolnir snapped the brush beneath their feet. It had been almost an hour since they started back into the forest. Enough time to recompose and focus on their new objective, but also plenty of time for the rebels to mount an offensive. Ava wondered if they'd discovered the tower guard's body yet. If they did, they'd likely already have the base locked down. The search for intruders would come next, a search that would rapidly expand to other areas within their territory. At this point in the mission, night had fully set in. The moonless sky was their ally, shrouding them in darkness. But they were still alone in enemy territory with a broken ComSat connection, not ideal when making on-the-fly decisions.
Lights.
Sarah pointed ahead, slightly right of where the dirt road led. Ava nodded.
Let's head in that direction. This road likely leads to a checkpoint anyways. We'd be serving ourselves up on a platter.
Her comment got a chuckle out of Ed, who seemed to be warming up to Eva. He may have started to appreciate her direct approach to leadership, or simply enjoyed her dry sense of humor. Sarah, though, she still had an air of defiance about her. Ava raised her hand, clenched her fist, and motioned an order to crouch. They were close enough now that they could use their eyes, albeit enhanced with night vision, instead of their helmets' zoomed-in camera feeds. The lights that Sarah had identified were floodlights mounted to large poles, probably 5 meters tall. A couple of dark silhouettes moved near the base of each light. Upon closer inspection, Ava saw they were rebels milling about, patrolling with rifles in hand. She was relieved to see that they seemed bored. It meant the hunt for them hadn't started. At least, not yet.
Not quite the pious Inquisitor,
Sarah quipped. Comparing the building to a Covenant battlecruiser, the one that invaded Earth no less, was like comparing a grain of sand to a mountain.
It doesn't take a glassing beam to cause problems,
Ava rebuked.
A single wraith could level an entire city block.
Sarah didn't respond, but gave a shrug that told Eva she got the point. The building was surprisingly inconspicuous. It was about the size of a private aircraft hangar, square with a wide strip of grass separating it and the chain-link fence that ran the perimeter. Ed let out a sigh.
As much as I hate sitting around, we should probably wait to call this in.
He looked to Eva for a response. On one hand, she wanted to empower her squad mates to speak up and make calls. On the other, she needed to see what the rebels had acquired. They could be waiting hours, potentially days, for the connection with command to be re-established. Ava's voice was diplomatic and calculated.
We don't know when we'll get our link to the comsat back. This wasn't the mission, but it's of interest to ONI and the UNSC.
She continued, looking directly at Ed.
With that in mind, what would you do?
Ed looked at the ground, obviously thinking it over. His head popped back up, as if he'd found what he'd been looking for. He sounded a bit unsure of himself, but genuine.
I'd make the executive decision to check it out. That's what we Spartans are for, right? We trained for this.
Ava wondered what training the Spartan 4s received, and if it was anything like the training she went through on Reach. Beginning as fully grown adults instead of children was one difference to start.
I agree,
she said before looking at Sarah.
What about you?
Sarah was silent through their brief exchange, but that didn't mean her opinion was absent.
I think I've been itching to see what's in there since we arrived,
she said with an audible grin. Ava perked up.
It's settled then. We infiltrate the base, Ed flank and approach from the west. Sarah and I will converge with you on that end of the facility.
Ed flicked his indicator light green and moved off into the brush. As he did, Eva pinged Flight Officer Riley.
Alpha Leader to Alpha 1, we've found an additional rebel facility.
She paused to take a breath.
We're going to investigate, but be prepped for rapid evac.
Riley wasted no time in responding.
Copy that, Captain. Just say the word and I'm there.
His voice was relaxed.
I've set her down in a ravine. No one's bothered me just yet.
Ava nodded at Sarah, slowly rising from her crouched position. The pair raised their rifles and walked in the direction of the silhouettes. They moved slowly, placing each step carefully. The high-load brushless actuators in their Mark 7 armor gave them full control of the speed and weight behind each movement. It allowed them to move quietly, despite the heft of Mjolnir. The guards bounced between the light poles at a consistent interval, periodically glancing out into the abyssal darkness beyond the fence. Ed's lowered voice came through the comm channel.
In position, awaiting signal.
Sarah extended her pinky and index fingers to point at the two floodlights. Then she swiped her hand across her neck and swiftly clinched her fist. Ava understood. They'd have to be damn near perfectly coordinated, but 4 well-placed bullets would darken the area and remove the guards. She pointed to herself, then to the light closest to them. They took aim, and Ava changed her indicator light to green, giving Ed the all-clear to engage. After a few muffled pops, the front area of the facility's lot was thrown into total blackness. Less than a second later, the guards collapsed to the ground.
Cameras at both corners,
Sarah said.
We've got
Ed interrupted.
There was one camera over here. I took care of it. If they don't already think something is fishy, they will real soon.
Eva squatted, then leapt over the fence and jogged toward the rally point, firing 2 more shots. Sarah stayed back, sweeping with her rifle to cover Eva as she moved.
Clear, cameras handled. I'm in position.
Eva looked in Sarah's direction.
Sarah, on me, I've got you covered.
The 3 Spartans regrouped at the western entrance of the building. As Ed approached the door, he placed one of his lock-picking devices on the entry pad.
This is my last one,
he said as it let out an artificial chirp.
Any locked doors we run into now will need a little more persuasion.
The door parted in front of them, but they remained still. Bright fluorescent light poured out of the doorway and onto their armor.
We walk in there and our cover is blown,
Ava said. Ed reached for a stun grenade on his thigh.
I'm able to blind cameras with these, but it'll only be for a second or two.
If they weren't moments from being engaged by insurgent forces, Ava would have taken the time to find the facility's power generators and deactivated them. But they didn't have the luxury of time. They'd have to play this fast and loose. Ava turned her head to Sarah.
You go left. I'll go right.
Then she looked to Ed.
Do it.
Ed tossed the grenade through the doorway. It clanked, bouncing twice before bursting into a flash of white. Sarah and Eva rushed in and made quick work of the cameras on either side of the hallway.
Just like target practice,
Sarah said.
Another door.
Eva pointed down the left end of the hallway. They rushed over, and Eva clicked a button on the entry pad. No luck. It was locked. She dug her gloved fingertips into the narrow center crease of the door and pulled. It began to open, shaking as she parted the thick sheets of metal. They slammed open once reaching the integrated spring latch system, a common safety feature of interior doorways. The squad paused, locked in amazement. Beyond the corridor laid about a dozen Covenant vehicles and massive crates full of plasma-based weaponry. Eva figured it was enough for a solid ground assault. However, the rebels were stuck on Ixion without a ship to carry it off-world. It was clear they were stockpiling in preparation for something. But what they were planning was anyone's guess.
Well, I'll be.
Sarah muttered.
We hit the jackpot with this one.
Ed, try command again.
Eva ordered. Ed placed his hand to the side of his helmet and fiddled with controls on his HUD. After a few seconds, he looked back to Eva and shook his head. Within a matter of minutes, they had infiltrated an insurgent facility and gathered key intel on their capabilities, while at the same time being entirely cut off from their support network.
We can't stop here.
Eva said conclusively.
We need to make sure the rebels can't use this tech against us.
Ed and Sarah stood perfectly still, looking almost confused. They weren't used to operating autonomously, separate from a command structure. Whatever proposed went against the Vice Admiral's strict orders to stay undetected. At this point in her life, Eva was used to asking for forgiveness more often than permission. It was something she had done many times while deep behind enemy lines. Ed patted the large, hardened leather pouch mounted on his thigh.
If we want to torch this place, I've got a brick of C7 right here.
One brick of super-dense C7 plastic explosive could take out most of the vehicles, but wouldn't be enough to destroy the entire facility. They would need to pair it with an accelerant like fuel in a vehicle to get the desired outcome. Luckily for them, they had plenty to choose from. As Eva finished the thought, the facility's alarm system roared to life, siren blaring with red lights flashing at both ends of the hangar. Rebel troops poured in from adjacent corridors. They spread in a wide formation and took cover behind the purple-clad armament.
Sarah, cover this door.
Eva said.
Ed, time to get to work. Follow me.
Eva rose up and ran directly through the rebels' sight line. She opened fire, hitting 2 square in the chest, while bullets whizzed by her head. Ed threw his last stun grenade, giving Eva a chance to find shelter behind a group of crates. She popped back up to fire more shots, while Ed repositioned. The size of the hangar gave few options for proper maneuvering. It was likely they'd be stuck in this shootout for a while. Though the more time that passed, the worse it would get. And Eva had no idea how many rebels were stationed on Ixion. They could overwhelm the Spartans in a matter of minutes.
I think subtlety is out the window at this point,
Sarah said, sending rounds into the hall where they entered. Eva yelled to Ed.
Place that C7. We need to move.
She peeked out and fired more shots. The suppressive enemy fire continued, and now included plasma rounds.
Alpha 1, we need exfil. Pick up on the western side of the structure.
Shots pinged off of Eva's cover.
Sarah, transmit coordinates.
Riley responded.
Copy that, Captain. Exfil en route.
Ed rushed to the column of Wraith tanks, sitting along the furthest wall. If he placed the explosives close to the middle of the column, there was a higher chance they'd get the damage radius they wanted. But that put Ed's target about 30 meters away, through bullets and plasma.
I need that C7 planted now, Spartan.
Eva ordered. Ed pivoted out into enemy fire. Hot spots of yellow lit up as projectiles impacted his armor's energy shielding. He dove behind the center Wraith and pulled out his brick of C7. Eva stopped firing and kneeled behind the crates to reload. As she did, she looked to Sarah, who was still covering their entry point, which was now their only exit. A rebel jumped at Sarah through the doorway, timing her blind spot perfectly. He managed to wrap his arm around her neck in a chokehold, a daring move to try on a Spartan. She threw down her rifle and reached over her head with both hands, grabbing the rebel by his jacket. She flung him forward, slammed him onto his back, and landed a clean punch to his face. His body went limp. Eva's attention was now directed at the unattended doorway. She fixed her sights on it and watched for movement.
Charge placed and timer set. We've got 60 seconds to...
Ed grunted. With Sarah back at their exit, Eva felt safe shifting her attention to the hangar. She peeked out to see Ed on the floor, indicator light flashing red.
Sarah, I need cover fire.
Eva barked as she ran to Ed's position. He was struggling to get up at first, but once Eva yanked him by his armor, he shouldered his rifle and started shooting. Now that Eva could see him up close, she saw that his shields had failed and he had been shot with a plasma pistol. His helmet was probably blaring at him to find cover and allow his shields to recharge. Without shielding, the plasma had melted through the undersuit on his lower back. She could see his flesh still sizzling from the extreme temperatures. The Spartans were in a tough spot, and it would be a whole lot worse if they didn't get out within the next 30 seconds.
Alpha 1 to Alpha Leader, I'm on approach. If y'all aren't outside when I get there, I'll have to swing back around,
Riley said.
It's too hot down there to sit around.
Eva gently shoved Ed towards Sarah.
Copy. We're on our way.
Eva fired a few more shots toward the rebels in the hangar as she walked backwards to the door. Sarah and Ed had already moved into the hallway, using the oldest tactic in the book. Cover and move. When they reached the exterior door, it was shut. No, welded. The rebels had flanked them and sealed off their only escape. Eva mentally kicked herself.
One exit? What was I thinking?
She thought. She tried kicking the door, ramming her hardened titanium alloy boot into it with tremendous force. After 3 solid blows, the weld cracked and the door caved in. Sarah sprinted at the door and drove her shoulder into it, finishing what Eva had started. They rushed outside, rifles still up, firing at anything that moved. Then they heard it, the reassuring roar of the Pelican's engines at full throttle. It appeared above the tree line and dove toward them, pivoting around so that the drop hatch faced them. Sarah jumped in and turned, still shooting at targets in the distance, while Ed hoisted himself up. He groaned in pain, flopping onto the compartment floor. Sarah yelled to Eva,
"Hop in, Captain."
Just as Eva turned to board the Pelican, the C-7's timer ticked to 0. A series of explosions sent fire, smoke, and plasma discharge into the air. The facility broke apart, flinging shrapnel in all directions. The entirety of Recon Alpha, Pelican included, were pushed away by the concussive force of the blast.
Shit!
Riley exclaimed. He had almost lost control of the ship, but managed to right its balance just before impacting the surrounding trees. Eva's vision was dark. She found herself flat on her stomach, disoriented. After a moment of looking around, she realized her HUD had completely disappeared. The usual sounds inside her helmet were absent. All she could hear was her heavy breathing and the muffled sound of settling debris. She ripped her helmet off and sprinted to the Pelican. As she ran, she glanced back to see the rebels had shifted their attention away from them and onto the fiery blaze.
"She's in,"
Sarah said.
"Get us out of here."
Riley jammed the throttle forward and pulled back on the Pelican's control stick. After clearing the tree line, he leveled out, but kept it at full throttle. Eva stared at Ed with her bare, hazel eyes.
"I'll be all right, Cap,"
he said assuredly. He was alive, but pretty badly injured. Hardly a win. She was still holding her helmet, and now had more than a millisecond to figure out what the hell happened to it. She looked it over, turning it to inspect from all angles.
"Well, that'll do it,"
she said, removing a piece of jagged shrapnel from the back of the helmet. It was times like these that she was thankful to be fully encased in Mjolnir. Her second skin saved her on more than one occasion. Eva walked to the cockpit and opened its door.
"Still no word from command?"
she asked Riley.
Not directly, ma'am,
he said.
But they're transmitting an all clear on UNSC channels. Likely just haven't gotten comms back up yet.
Eva pat him on the shoulder.
"Good. Take us home."
Chapter 6. Location, Ixion, Lapith System. Date, June 10th, 2555. Fitch stared at the lifeless body at his feet. The young man's head was mostly caved in, some of it pulverized and splattered across the floor. He was unrecognizable, but Fitch didn't need to see his face to know who he was. Karen, 19 years old and on a collision course with disaster, had been found drunkenly wandering one of the nearby forests. Although many of his men vocalized concerns, Fitch decided the kid was worth saving. He hoped recruiting Karen to the cause would give him purpose, something to keep his mind off of his obvious addiction and prepare him for the real world. Ixion was a fragile planet, ripe for UNSC control. His goal was to give its residents the power to remain independent. The task was a huge undertaking, but one he felt obligated to try. After all, he served the very organization that aspired to suppress these people. He owed them. Through his time as a Marine with the UNSC, Fitch developed a plethora of skills that allowed him to fight and survive in active combat environments. Over the last couple of years, he worked hard to pass those skills onto the often forgotten and neglected citizens of the outer colonies. The pool of blood under Karen was beginning to dry at its edges. Fitch deduced that he had been dead for at least an hour, maybe 2. He turned to Max, who had found the body when he came to relieve Karen from his shift.
How long had he been up here on duty?
Fitch asked.
About 12 hours?
Max answered timidly.
He said he'd pull the first half of my shift if I got him some liquor.
12 hours?
Fitch took a few steps toward Max, clutched his collar, and pulled him in close.
What the hell were you thinking?
Max didn't respond. His eyes darted between Fitch and the mess of blood and bottles on the floor. Fitch pushed Max away, then let out a long breath and pointed to the stairway.
Get out of my sight.
He looked back at Karen's body and began rattling off a list of potential causes in his head. He'd seen enough suicides over his lifetime to know this wasn't one, not with the kid's sidearm still holstered. Whoever killed Karen caught him off guard, and they were strong. No ordinary person would be able to inflict such a crushing blow. Fitch knelt to get a closer look.
A metal pipe, maybe?
He thought.
Even still, no one I know swings that hard.
He clutched the communications device clipped to his chest.
Gentlemen, we may have intruders. I need everyone on high alert until we clear the area.
He walked closer to the window and peered out. The tower window faced directly into the main courtyard where he had met with the Kigyar mercenary, Rith Cobb.
Could they have done this?
Fitch thought. Kigyar were slightly larger and stronger than your average human, so it wasn't unreasonable to consider them as suspects, though after the Human Covenant War, most Kigyar steered clear of fighting, only doing so when absolutely necessary. They'd rather be the middlemen capitalizing on the violence around them. It wouldn't make sense for them to upset a paying customer like Fitch. He knelt and grabbed the sidearm from Karen's holster before grabbing his communicator again. After ordering Max to retrieve Karen's body, Fitch made his way to the courtyard where a few of his men stood, discussing the situation. The potential threat was entirely unknown, so they needed to treat it as the worst-case scenario. Fitch pointed to a large, bald man with dark skin who had just slung a fully automatic MA3 assault rifle onto his shoulder.
Randall, assemble a squad and get over to the cache.
Fitch ordered.
Can't let whoever did this catch us with our pants down.
Randall nodded, then grabbed a Covenant plasma pistol off of a nearby crate. As he jogged away, another man approached the group, waving a data pad in the air.
Sir!
The man yelled.
You've got to see this.
He handed Fitch the data pad, its screen displaying multiple security camera feeds streaming live from the very cache he had just mentioned. 2 of the feeds, the main exterior cameras, were no longer receiving a signal. He watched as the 3rd exterior camera, then an interior, and another blinked off and turned to static.
Randall,
Fitch said over his communicator.
Our visitors are waiting for you at the cache.
We'll take care of them,
Randall responded.
Do we know who we're dealing with?
Fitch sighed.
No, not yet.
He lowered the datapad and started toward a Hog, the civilian variant of the UNSC's M12 Warthog assault vehicle. Its chassis was a dull blue, streaked with rust from years of exposure to the elements. As he jumped into the driver's seat, Fitch motioned to his men to hop aboard. They piled in, and one by one flicked their weapon safeties off. Rocks and dirt spit out from under the Hog's tires as Fitch throttled the accelerator, leaving a billowing cloud of dust in their place. They didn't make it further than 2 kilometers before Randall chimed in over the communicator.
We've engaged the intruders,
he shouted.
I've got no visual, can't see how many there are.
With his left hand still on the Hog's steering wheel, Fitch raised the datapad and saw movement and bright flashes on the 2 remaining feeds. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt, then double-tapped the screen to magnify the image. He let out a low gasp. What he saw he almost couldn't believe. 2 Spartans, the UNSC's cold-blooded automatons, were crouched behind weapon crates while Randall and the others fired upon them. Fitch thrust the Hog's accelerator forward and spoke over his communicator.
Keep your distance,
he said.
It's the UNSC and they sent their worst, Spartans.
Randall's frantic response was muffled by pops of gunfire and static.
They've already taken out 7 of our guys.
Hold tight!
Fitch yelled.
I'm on my way!
The hog's tail end whipped out as Fitch weaved through curves in the road. A few times they were launched into the air by dips in its surface. The men Fitch brought with him barely reacted. Straight-faced and eyes forward, their demeanor had noticeably changed after mention of the Spartans, likely because they'd never seen one in person, but heard plenty of stories about their merciless brutality. Cracks and pops grew louder as the taillights of the other hogs came into view. Fitch's heart was racing. Unlike the others, he had seen a Spartan in action on the battlefield. They were capable and efficient killing machines, but they weren't the invincible gods that Oni propped them up to be. Their presence on Ixion still worried him, though. His vision was suddenly filled by a flash of light, followed instantly by a thunderous boom that sent a shockwave in their direction. Fitch briefly lost control of the hog, drifting left, then right, before spinning a full rotation and sliding to a stop. He looked to the cache to see it crumbling in on itself, engulfed in flames and bursts of plasma. In a matter of moments he had lost vital weapons, vehicles, and a full squad of fighters, men he called friends. He throttled the hog again, barreling through the entry gate before swinging a hard left. He parked next to 2 hogs, turned onto their side, toppled over from the concussive blast.
Randall, are you all right?
Fitch yelled through his communicator.
Randall?
The men rushed out of the hog toward the disaster to save anyone they could.
There!
Fitch exclaimed, pointing at a pelican hovering on the western side of the cache.
There they are!
His men were already too busy clearing rubble and searching for survivors to hear him, so Fitch charged the pelican alone. He counted 3 Spartans rushing away from the rubble and into the ship's drop hatch. Pointless as it was, he raised the sidearm that he had recovered from Karen's body and fired 3 shots. Just as quickly as it had come, the pelican peeled off into the night. The sound of its engines faded rapidly, leaving only crackling flames and the occasional thud of settling debris. It took Fitch and the others a few hours, but they confirmed that there were no survivors under the destruction. Once the fires were under control, he ordered his men to begin recovery of any bodies or assets they could. He hopped back into the hog and started down the dirt road to the base. Now suddenly alone with his thoughts, Fitch wondered why the Spartans were there to begin with. His plans had nothing to do with the UNSC outside of equipping Ixion's citizens with the ability to defend against their tyranny.
The assholes just want us on the back foot,
he thought.
They want us incapable and reliant so they can use us.
When Fitch reached the base, he was surprised with the sight of Rithkob's ship parked in the courtyard. A small group of Fitch's men were surrounding Rith and his 2 Kigyar bodyguards, weapons raised.
Now what?
Fitch said as he stepped out of the hog. He broke through the line of his men and gave Rith a subtle nod.
Back so soon? Did you get what I asked for?
Rith snapped his beak-like jaw.
What is reason for these hostilities? We've done nothing to provoke.
Fitch raised his hand and motioned for his men to lower their weapons.
They're just on edge. Our mutual friends at the UNSC paid us a visit after you left.
UNSC? Here?
Rith's head pivoted back and forth.
Relax,
Fitch said.
They're gone for now.
He pointed to the Kigyar's ship.
Did you get what I asked for, or what?
Rith nodded.
Yes, we found Covenant weapon more easy than we thought.
Great, where are they?
Fitch asked. Rith touched a device on his wrist that projected a holographic blue sphere.
The Gerald Hanai faction has them here.
Fitch rattled the word around in his head, but couldn't place it.
The who?
You humans call them brutes.
Rith rolled his eyes and scoffed.
They have much Covenant technology, ships, weapons.
Fitch was cautiously intrigued. He needed to replenish Ixion's arsenal, and fast. The brutes were a species he hadn't interacted with since his time as a Marine. He remembered them as hulking, blood-hungry beasts with uncontrollable rage. But the UNSC was already showing interest in Ixion, likely for its natural resources and strategic positioning in the greater galaxy. He knew that without ample weapons and vehicles, the quiet colony world would crumble under the might of its oppressor.
And where is this planet exactly?
Fitch asked, trying to seem less interested than he was. Rith stared into Fitch's eyes, looking excited that the question was asked. He snapped his jaw together and responded.
They eat human. You want to go there?
Since you're too cowardly to, yes.
Fitch snapped.
I'll pay our original price for the coordinates.
The 3 Kigyar quietly deliberated in their native language, unintelligible for Fitch and his men. Rith crossed his arms.
You are naive, human, but you have a deal.
After counting his payment, Rith handed Fitch a small, generic-looking data chip.
Don't tell them I sent you,
Rith said as he turned toward his ship. Fitch wasted no time. He pulled out his datapad and inserted the chip. The device let out a chime, indicating a match within its database. He read the text that appeared on the display.
Equinox system,
He said quietly.
Colo.
Chapter 7. Location. Coordinates redacted. Office of Naval Intelligence, Space Station, Sol System. Date, June 12, 2555. Ava's trepidation lingered well after departing Ixion, growing stronger as Recon Alpha's Pelican dropped out of slipspace into friendly territory. A member of her team was injured following her orders that blatantly went against the directive to remain undetected. Not only that, but they hadn't had a clear line of communication to command in days, and she still didn't know why. Flight Officer Riley's voice came over the troop base speaker.
On approach. Initiating landing sequence.
Eva stepped into the cockpit and looked to the station. Hulking yellow gantries surrounded an area she knew to be the armory, and it was clear that the structure took serious damage. Riley began flipping switches, not looking up as he spoke to Ava.
Well, there's the reason for our comms blackout. Whatever happened took out the arrays,
he said.
Let's hope that's all it did,
Ava responded. Unmanned maintenance drones whipped around the exterior of the station, welding support beams and placing thick plates of glass at a neck-breaking pace. They ignored the Pelican as it floated gracefully through the hangar's energy-shielded doors and touched down. When the Pelican's drop hatch opened, medical personnel rushed to Ed, who still hadn't received proper treatment for the plasma burns that covered half his torso. If he was feeling any pain, he did a tremendous job of masking it, simply holding his side as he walked with them to the infirmary. Now back at the station, he'd be treated with flash-cloned skin grafts, along with a debriding agent to eliminate the risk of infection. That, in tandem with his Spartan 4 augmentations, would bring him back to normal in a matter of hours. Another group, this time standard infantry, walked up and collected Recon Alpha's weapons and gear, including Eva's damaged helmet.
Captain,
Sarah gave Eva a tap on the shoulder.
the Vice Admiral is requesting you meet with him in the command center.
She tapped her helmet.
I told him about your bucket being bricked.
Thanks.
Ava responded.
Tell him I'm on my way.
She started toward the command center, but hesitated and turned back to Sarah.
And make sure Ed's all right.
Sarah nodded.
Planned on it.
Moving through the halls of the station was starting to feel like a regularly scheduled therapy session to Eva. The monotonous walks made her mind wander, and with no HUD, she couldn't distract herself with her after-action report. She lingered on what had happened to Ed. It could have easily been her, in fact. It would have been if she were solo on the mission as she'd requested. She shook her head, trying to focus on the situation at hand. In a few moments, she would have to answer to the Vice Admiral for her insubordination. With most of the military officials she answered to, Ava would simply explain the facts that led to her decision. Many times they'd trust her judgment, but the Vice Admiral wouldn't be so easily convinced. She approached the command center, where 2 Marines guarded the entrance, shifting to attention as Eva rounded the corner. One of them pressed the door's entry pad and gave her a salute as she passed by. When she walked in, she was met with Vice Admiral Long standing exactly where she had left him. But this time, he had company. A Spartan, standing a meter or so behind him, faced Eva with their arms crossed. The details of their black armor were obscured by the various consoles that surrounded them, but the orange glimmer of their visor was clear as day. They didn't move a muscle as she stepped into the room.
What happened to your helmet, Spartan?
Long asked.
Shrapnel.
She responded succinctly. Long frowned.
There wouldn't have been any shrapnel if you hadn't disobeyed my orders.
She stared directly into the Vice Admiral's eyes, her gaze as hardened as her armor. He continued, raising his voice slightly.
Now I have 2 damaged Mjolnir systems, an injured Spartan, and innies with enough anti-UNSC propaganda to convert an entire colony.
He paused for a moment, then slapped the hollow table. A schematic of the station's armory flashed bright red and hovered over the surface.
To top it off,
Long said,
your friend Dahlgren decided to try his luck with a bit of terrorism.
Eva's wall of stoicism cracked, and her eyes widened. She was so distracted with what happened on Ixion that she neglected any thoughts about Gerald. She snapped back into her rigid facade.
You'll have to clarify what you mean, sir.
What I mean is he defected to the insurrection.
Long barked.
The traitor barricaded himself in the armory and blew himself to hell. Luckily, he only managed to kill himself.
After an immediate dose of shock and confusion, thoughts rushed into Ava's mind.
How could something like this happen in an Oni facility?
She thought.
I should have stayed. I could have stopped him.
She composed herself, then changed the subject of the conversation to mask her concern regarding Dahlgren.
And our next mission directive?
Ava asked.
That's classified.
Long sneered.
I'll be sending another fire team to clean up your mess. Recon Alpha is off this assignment, and I'll be speaking to your superiors about your inability to follow orders.
Eva stepped forward.
If you saw the video, you'd see that the rebels had enough Covenant artillery to ensure heavy UNSC losses on Ixion. We made sure that wouldn't happen.
The Vice Admiral shook his head.
There is no video. It was lost when your helmet was damaged. Just another failure to add to your growing list, Captain. You're dismissed.
As much as she wanted to, there was no use fighting it. He'd speak to Oni's commander-in-chief, Admiral Seren Osman, who would likely suspend Eva from active duty, but it would be short-lived. The Queen of Oni didn't sideline valuable assets like the Spartans for very long. Before turning away, Eva stole another look at the unknown Spartan behind Long. They were taller than the others she'd seen walking the station, standing almost eye-to-eye with her. If she didn't know any better, she could have mistook them for a Spartan too, like herself. But that would be impossible. The surviving Spartans of her class were scattered across the galaxy, far from humanity's home system. Eva decided it best to make her way to the infirmary. She needed to check on Ed, and with any luck, he or Sarah would have information on her mystery Spartan. Low, consistent beeps merged with hushed voices as she approached the infirmary. It was an eerily sterile place, void of the dust, oil, and dirt that caked the walls in the rest of the station.
Hey there, Spartan.
A gentle, feminine voice called. A young nurse approached Ava and smiled.
I assume you're here to see Chief Campbell?
Affirmative.
Ava replied. The nurse pointed to a nearby room.
He's right over here.
She brought Ava into a room where Sarah stood, leaning against a wall, while Ed sat on the edge of his bed. His Mjolnir had been fully removed, replaced with a lightweight, blue patient gown.
Bet you never thought you'd see me like this.
He quipped.
I'm just glad to see you're all right.
Ava said.
How was the patch-up?
Good enough that I'll be ready for redeployment as soon as tomorrow.
Ed replied.
Doc just says to be careful. What's our next move?
Ava crossed her arms.
There isn't one. The Vice Admiral took us off the assignment.
What?
Ed asked. Sarah quickly interjected.
We went against his orders. What did you think was going to happen?
She placed both hands on her hips and shook her head.
I'm just glad we're not getting court-martialed.
Ed looked back to Eva.
Who's on the assignment?
Not sure.
She replied.
But there was a Spartan in the command center. Black armor, orange visor, tall.
That would be Isaac.
Sarah said.
He leads Fireteam Ember.
Ember is a special infiltration unit.
Ed added.
Wonder what the Vice Admiral has planned.
I can find out.
Sarah said.
Their pilot and I served together in the 65th. If Ember is here, then so is she.
The 65th Shock Troops Division was an orbital drop shock trooper unit of the UNSC Marine Corps. Amidst the countless battles, fallen comrades, and fiery drops from orbit, ODSTs built strong bonds not seen elsewhere in the UNSC. Sarah would have no trouble getting the intel they were after. Ava nodded at Sarah.
Do it.
Sarah flashed a brief half-salute and walked out of the room. As the door shut, Ed stood up and gave Eva a concerned look.
What are you up to?
He asked.
We've been shelved. No use stirring things up.
Shelved for now.
Ava responded.
You should sit back down and rest up. Sarah or myself will keep you posted.
Ed cracked a smile.
Is that an order?
Affirmative, Spartan.
Ava said, with a grin. She was finally solidifying Ed and Sarah's trust in her, despite the repercussions of the events on Ixion. Beneath the surface, both Spartans knew that Eva made the right call. There was no certainty that the UNSC would invade Ixion, but now if they did, they'd face far less resistance, with far fewer casualties. As Eva left the room, the young nurse rushed towards her, waving a slip of paper in the air.
Ma'am!
She shouted.
This message came through for you at the front desk.
Ava took the paper, thanked the nurse, and continued out of the infirmary, unfolding the paper as she walked. Captain Eva 033, report to comm station 14G.
The Vice Admiral is a man of his word. I'll give him that.
Ava thought to herself. It was time for her to face the music. She hadn't talked to her commander-in-chief since being aboard Dahlgren's ship. At that time, Eva was providing Admiral Osman with a debrief of her recon mission to Shuo and how she ended up crashing out of slipspace with a malfunctioning ship. Not knowing quite what to expect from the interaction, Ava began an attempt at recalling every detail of their actions on Ixion. She tried to find any blatant lapses of judgment, but found nothing. She entered a hallway lined with doors labeled alphanumerically, each leading to an individual communications station. The stations were mostly used by personnel to speak with friends and family, away from the watchful eye of the station's artificial intelligence. They were small rooms, certainly not designed to allow a fully armored Spartan to sit comfortably within them. Ava opened the door to 14G, stepped in, and adjusted until she was able to sit. Once settled, she reached over and clicked the comms relay switch to open the channel. Admiral Osman appeared on screen, sitting in a large metal chair with red upholstery peeking out from behind her. Her years of serving Oni appeared as the shallow lines on her tan complexion, with streaks of gray beginning to appear in her otherwise dark hair.
Sorry for the tight squeeze, Captain,
she said to Ava.
I didn't want an audience for our chat.
Not a problem, ma'am. I'm used to it.
Ava replied.
Indeed.
Osman smiled.
The Vice Admiral informed me of your mission to Ixion.
Ava gripped the armrests of her chair, bracing for a fury of punishment. She jumped on the opportunity to explain herself.
The rebels had an entire cache of fully functional Covenant weapons and vehicles. Recon Alpha took the opportunity to—
Captain,
Osman interrupted.
I know why you did what you did, and I would have made the same call if I were in your position.
Ava's head tilted in confusion. Osman continued.
You completed your mission. Thanks to you, we know who the Innies got the weapons from.
She crossed her arms.
Now we just need to find the Kigyar's source and remove it from the equation.
This long after the Human-Covenant War, if a Covenant ship or weapon was damaged, there was no repairing it. More imitative than innovative, the alien technology was created by reverse engineering ancient artifacts from the now extinct civilization of the Forerunners, the Covenant's so-called gods. The Covenant's religious laws barred any inquiry into the inner workings of the Forerunner technology. This meant most of them didn't understand what to fix, let alone how. Eva relaxed her shoulders and started breathing again.
I believe Fireteam Ember is on assignment to do just that.
Osman chuckled.
Am I sensing a bit of resentment, Captain?
No, ma'am.
Ava muttered.
Sorry, ma'am.
Osman waved off the remark.
Fireteam Ember has been sent to find the Kigyar and locate their suppliers. Should they succeed, I'll be sending you to finish the job. 1 Spartan 2 is worth a dozen 4s.
And what about Sherwin Fitch?
Ava asked.
The aspiring Innie General?
Osman said, unconcerned.
We know Ixion has no ships, otherwise they'd use them. He won't be a problem until we're on the planet's surface.
Ava disagreed that Fitch wasn't a priority threat, but swallowed any dissent.
Understood,
she said.
I want a direct line of communication with you from here on out,
Osman ordered.
I'll have your new helmet fitted with an uplink tied to an encrypted Oni channel.
Eva shifted in her seat.
Can I make a request, ma'am?
Certainly,
Osman responded.
My Mark 6 helmet. Am I permitted to integrate it with my current armor set?
Ava felt a sense of slight embarrassment.
It's already fitted with a Farndale uplink.
Osman smirked.
Of course, we're all sentimental about something. If it's still at the station, I'll have it delivered to your quarters.
Ava perked up.
Thank you, ma'am.
Keep all of this between us for now, Captain,
Osman said with a straight face.
I'll be in touch.
The screen went black, and Eva sat in silence, enjoying the brief moment of quiet before exiting the comm station. Although Admiral Osman seemed to favor Eva for the moment, it was important that she remember the things Oni was capable of. It wouldn't be easy, but if a Spartan gave the Admiral enough grief, she'd be sure they were dead within the week. Ava's path to the barracks led her past the armory, where a squad of Marines held security in front of a black, tarp-like wall. Behind it was the result of Dahlgren's desperation and an active crime scene investigation. She felt the urge to investigate the scene herself.
And what would I be looking for?
She thought. It seemed pointless to pursue, as the situation was quite straightforward. Dahlgren was convinced that the UNSC was an evil organization with the sole intention of creating chaos and pain throughout the independent colonies. He acted on his suspicions and paid the ultimate price. Ava would find nothing at the scene that hadn't already been discovered, so she made a decision. From that moment on, she would attempt to dispel any thoughts about Dahlgren deep into the abyss of her mind. Spartan 2s were hardwired for dissociation. Dr. Catherine Halsey, the creator of the Spartan 2 program, argued that their conditioning allowed the Spartans to operate at peak efficiency in high-stress environments. She would go on to be proven correct, time and time again. But that didn't make it right. Without pause, Eva continued past the armory and on to the barracks, her mind becoming clearer with every step. She approached the door to her quarters and pressed the entry pad, her eyes immediately locking onto the helmet that sat neatly on her bed. She rolled it from side to side as she picked it up, inspecting its exterior. It remained weathered, but undamaged, including the Farndale uplink mounted on its right side. Bowing forward, she lifted the helmet onto her head. The custom-molded padding interior hugged her skull as the internal pressure seals hissed and locked in place. Almost immediately, the Mark 7 platform integrated with the Mark 6 helmet. Its HUD came to life in a flash of pale blue. Key information such as shield strength and proximity radar hovered just within Eva's peripheral vision. After a series of quick tests, a notice appeared front and center. Interoperability successful. Chapter 8. Location. Coordinates redacted. Office of Naval Intelligence Space Station. Sol System. Date: June 15th, 2555.
Go!
Eva yelled.
Do it now!
Sarah bounced from one barrier to the next, narrowly avoiding the onslaught of bullets hurling toward her. Peeking out from their cover, Ed and Eva fired shots at the automated turrets mounted to the ceiling.
Turret 1 eliminated,
Ed remarked. Sarah leapt into the air and arched over the 5-meter barrier wall, blocking her path. Just before her boots hit the ground, she reached for the M363 sticky detonator sidearm mounted to her thigh and released its safety.
Get up there, Ed.
Eva pointed squarely at Sarah.
She's going to need your help. I'll handle the other turret.
Ed flashed a green indicator light and held his position, waiting for a window to move. Eva backtracked a couple of meters, then maneuvered to flank around the backside of the turret. She dove into a prone position behind the ungainly remains of a Jiralhanai captain and rested her MA-40 assault rifle on its back. She flashed her indicator light green and opened fire. Ed sprinted to the barrier wall and sprang off an adjacent pillar, boosting him high into the air. On his way to the ground, he let off multiple shots from his DMR, eliminating 2 Kigyar approaching Sarah from the rear. When Ed got to her, she was kneeling over a Jiralhanai with her combat knife jammed into its neck.
I've got your back,
he said.
Go!
Sarah yanked the knife from the brute's neck and shifted her attention to the enemy communications relay tucked away in a dark corner. She was a bit far from the target, but had a direct line of sight to take her shot. She aimed her sticky detonator directly at the relay. Just before she squeezed the trigger, a Sangheli dropped at her from above, rearing its energy sword back for a strike. The bright-hot blue glow of the weapon flared in Sarah's HUD. As she braced herself, 2 short bursts rang out, and the Sangheli slammed to the floor beside her. She looked up to see Eva standing on a pillar, assault rifle fixed on the Sangheli.
You're clear,
Eva said.
Take the shot.
Sarah raised the sticky detonator again and fired. The round flew through the air and stuck onto the relay. She squeezed the trigger once more to initiate detonation.
Training simulation complete. Mission successful,
boomed a disembodied female voice. The walls, pillars, and various alien bodies began to vanish into particles of light. After a few seconds, only the Spartans remained. Eva, Ed, and Sarah had spent the past 3 days training within the station's War Games chamber. The chamber used hard light projections, a technology reverse-engineered from Forerunner technology to simulate real-time battle scenarios. It provided soldiers an opportunity to hone their skills and strategies without the risks of live engagements. Through each run of the simulations, Eva became more acquainted with her squad mates. She learned that Sarah was much faster than either her or Ed, something she wished she'd known sooner. It made her wonder about the events on Ixion. Had she ordered Sarah to plant the C7, the situation may have turned out differently. Ed, even with all of his confidence, was best fit for a supportive role on the team, providing cover and putting himself wherever Eva or Sarah needed him most. Most importantly, Eva was beginning to relearn what it meant to be a leader, knowing her people, their strengths and weaknesses, and facilitating their success. As they exited the War Games chamber, Ava looked through a nearby window overlooking the station's exterior and caught a glimpse of a ship entering the hangar. She quickly identified it as a Prowler, the stealth-capable ships used by Oni for infiltration operations. As the hangar doors closed, a notice appeared on Ava's HUD. Incoming message, black-level encryption, retinal scan required. A light flashed brightly into Ava's right eye as she continued to follow Ed and Sarah toward the barracks. Retinal scan completed. Begin message. Admiral Osman's voice was unmistakable.
Spartan, I hope this message finds you well. I've received word that Fireteam Ember was rather successful in their mission.
She took a breath.
They pulled the Kig-Yar ship's slipspace logs and found the location of their supplier.
There was quite a long pause before she continued.
They visited a planet in the Equinox system multiple times over the last few cycles. I believe you're familiar with Kolo?
Ava's gut sank.
Given the nature of the situation and your history with Kolo, your squad mates from Recon Alpha will join you on the mission. You will be briefed together aboard your ship.
Message completed. Message deleted. Ava's HUD cleared as Ed and Sarah's voices faded in through her helmet's internal speakers. The two were discussing the various models of the MA5 assault rifle, debating which proved more effective at dispatching targets.
You're awfully quiet on the subject,
Sarah said playfully, looking at Eva.
We've got new orders,
Ava stated. Ed's head tilted.
When? Just now?
Ava nodded.
Affirmative.
And here I thought you weren't a spook,
Sarah said, shaking her head.
Anything else you'd like to tell us?
I'm not keeping anything from you,
Ava said assuredly.
You know as much as I do. Briefing will be done en route to our destination.
The tension that Ava had worked to overcome was suddenly thrust back to the forefront of the team's dynamic. She reminisced of her days with Echo Team. Working alongside her fellow Spartan 2s was much less nuanced and emotionally charged. But that was the result of childhood indoctrination and disciplinary training. Distrust of authority was as uncommon to them as a birthday celebration.
Give her a break, Sarah,
Ed said.
We're not Oni, can't expect to be read in on everything.
Sarah shook her head as the three Spartans changed course toward the hangar. Ava wanted the team to avoid any conversations of secrecy and focus on the mission at hand, whatever that mission may be. With any luck, the frustration from her team would dissipate by the time they reached their ship. When they arrived at the hangar's main corridor, the squad was approached by a Spartan in black Mjolnir, the very same Spartan that stood behind Vice Admiral Long in the command center. The corridor was brightly lit, and she could see him more clearly than before. He wore mostly standard Mark 7 armor, but with a Mark 5 Zeta helmet, the Gen 3 variant of what Eva wore throughout her time with Echo Team. He halted his stride directly in front of them.
Captain,
he said.
Sorry we weren't previously introduced. Name's Isaac Spencer.
Isaac extended his arm and shook Ava's hand before settling back into his default, crossed arms stance.
You have quite the reputation around here. If only Oni were as public-facing as the UNSC, you'd be great for recruitment.
Ava didn't know whether to feel appreciated or offended.
Maybe so, but I prefer being out of the spotlight. All that matters is the mission.
Right.
Isaac looked past her at Ed and Sarah.
Hope y'all are prepped for Kolo. Judging by their comms records, the Kig-Yar were pretty skittish about that place.
Ava glanced back and saw her squad mates exchange a look. Although she was probably as uneasy about Kolo as the Kig-Yar, she couldn't make that known.
The Kig-Yar are skittish about a lot of things,
she responded.
We'll be fine.
Well, I hope the intel my team gathered gives you an edge. With only 3 Spartans, you're gonna need it.
He began to walk away, but turned back for a moment.
Oh, and next time, don't send your team to spy. They'd make terrible spooks.
He gave a loose salute as he turned away.
See you around, Captain.
Ava looked at Sarah, who responded with a shrug. She had spoken with Angeli Pierce, her former battle buddy and member of Fireteam Ember, but was only able to scratch the surface of their mission plans. Angeli took her role in Fireteam Ember very seriously, and although she and Sarah had a storied past together, she wasn't keen on passing around classified information. Not that it mattered. Recon Alpha would eventually be briefed on everything Fireteam Ember uncovered aboard the Kig-Yar ship. The 3 Spartans made their way into the hangar. They'd be flying aboard a Pelican retrofit with active camouflage for their mission. The stealth tech typically seen on Prowlers would allow them to drop into Kolo unnoticed but wouldn't force them into a larger, less nimble ship. Ava was the first to board. As she did, she saw a familiar face approaching from the cockpit.
Hey there, Captain.
Riley said with a smile.
Ready for another daring flight into enemy territory?
Ava allowed herself a chuckle.
Happy to see you'll be taking us in.
She patted Riley on the shoulder.
But maybe this time we avoid the evasive maneuvers?
Can't make any promises, ma'am.
He said.
Welcome aboard.
Ava walked aft to the troop bay and pressed a button on the bulkhead that activated the ship's hologram projectors. A topographical representation of Kolo appeared, flooding the interior of the Pelican in green light. The other 2 Spartans boarded behind her and sat on the benches mounted on either side of the troop bay. The Pelican's engines spooled up as it rose, hovering in place before drifting into open space. Once they were clear of the hangar, Ava moved to look out of the small window in the Pelican's drop hatch. She looked at the armory, most of which was repaired to its original condition. It didn't take long for Gerald Dahlgren and his actions, both good and bad, to be wiped from history, at least officially. As a formality, Oni would keep a report filed away in its archives, but it would be buried. They wouldn't want anyone to learn of the lapse in their security. Eventually, everyone at the station would forget Dahlgren ever existed, all except for Eva. As much as she tried, she couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at her subconscious. Another notice blinked on her HUD. Incoming transmission.
Riley, I'm patching through a transmission from my uplink.
She placed her hand on the device mounted to her helmet.
Can you transmit it through to the bay?
You got it,
Riley responded. A static voice came through the troop bay speakers.
Recon Alpha, this is Admiral Osman. The intelligence that Fireteam Ember collected pointed us to a weapons supplier on the planet Kolo.
The hologram of the planet spun and a red circle appeared, rippling on its surface. The circle was nestled in a mountain valley next to a small body of water.
You are to survey the supplier's facilities and report back for further orders.
The Admiral continued.
We've sent recon drones ahead of you to survey the geography. Your TAC map will update once you're in range of their transmitters.
Ava looked to her squad mates, who sat motionless, fixated on the hologram. For a moment, she imagined Raj and Sebastian sitting in their place.
What about the geysers?
Ava asked.
Ma'am.
We have to assume the geysers are still active.
The Admiral responded. Sarah stood and began pointing at the hologram.
And the drones? Their thermal optics may be able to pinpoint hotspots.
She looked to Eva.
They can watch our advance and suggest changes in direction.
An excellent suggestion, Chief. I'll order them to do just that.
Eva could hear the Admiral's smile and felt a slight sense of pride for Sarah's willingness to speak up.
I'll be in touch as things progress. Good luck, Recon Alpha.
Osman's farewell was followed by a distorted click before the hologram projectors abruptly shut off. Eva reached for the handheld datapad stuck to the hull. She grabbed it, sat on the bench opposite to Ed and Sarah, and stared at its blank screen. After a short, awkward silence, Eva looked up at them.
I need to brief you on Kolo.
Chapter 9. Location: Planetary Surface, Kolo, Equinox System. Date: February 5th, 2549.
Repeat.
Ava grunted.
Echo Team status.
The fog thickened as mist from the exploding geyser settled at the ground level. Still disoriented from the blast, Ava limped in a direction she hoped would lead her to Raj. Her helmet blared, and an accompanying notice blinked on her HUD, stating that her shield module suffered catastrophic damage. There was no time for diagnostics. Not far ahead, half buried in the muck, she spotted the familiar shape of a suppressed BR-75 battle rifle. She knelt, picked it up, and racked its chamber in a single fluid motion. The forest around her was now unnervingly still, apart from the wet thud of her boots as she stepped. To fight her growing dread, she tried her team's communication channel again.
Raj, Sebastian, status,
she said before a hiss of static chirped in her ear.
Green here,
Sebastian replied.
But I'm looking at 3 Covey squads headed in your direction.
Relief washed over Eva. Sebastian was still in the fight. He continued.
Judging by their bearing, they know exactly where you are.
Copy, regroup on my position,
she ordered. She pressed forward until a glint of light pierced through the oppressive fog and caught her eye. It was strobing in a standard UNSC SOS code pattern. She wasted no time rushing over, mud splashing with each step. Her HUD tagged the light source as S108. It was Raj. She approached and saw him lying on his back against the trunk of a fallen tree. When his body came into focus, she froze. in disbelief. A shard of bedrock, almost 25 centimeters long, just as wide, and 6 centimeters thick, protruded from his chest. Its jagged form had pierced through the multiple layers of his Mjolnir as if it were paper, no doubt assisted by the burst of radioactivity that depleted his energy shielding. Blood slowly seeped from the wound and pooled on the forest floor. His helmet tilted slightly, snapping Eva out of shock.
Don't go mourning me just yet,
Raj said through the static of the team comm channel.
You've got a mission to complete.
Eva knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder plate.
Mission's over,
she said.
We're getting you out of here.
Raj attempted a chuckle that morphed into a raspy cough.
I'm cooked, Cap.
He grunted in pain.
I'll follow protocol. It'll create a diversion so you and Seb can get the hell off this rock.
Eva clenched her jaw. Raj was completely immobile, and it was clear moving him through Kolo's terrain would prove challenging. Even if she carried him out, there'd be little chance he'd survive extraction. Much to her dismay, he was right. In situations where a Spartan was fatally wounded or otherwise trapped on the battlefield, protocol dictated that they initiate the fail-safe detonation built into their Mjolnir. This ensured that the cutting-edge, proprietary technology wouldn't fall into enemy hands. Eva sat motionless before the urgency of the moment pulled her back to reality. She nodded sharply at Raj and stood up. The unfortunate reality for the Spartan twos was that most would live short lives. Each one of them knew that one day, if deemed necessary, they would die fighting for humanity. It was their duty. The sound of rapid footsteps approaching from behind roused Eva's attention. She turned and snapped into a firing position.
Easy, Cap,
Sebastian said as he slowed to a halt.
Maintain security,
she said, snapping back into her role as leader.
Don't want any surprises.
Sebastian looked past her at Raj.
Shit.
His shoulders sagged.
What happened?
Damn geyser got me good,
Raj said through blood in his mouth. Sebastian looked back to Eva.
What's our move?
Raj shakily lifted his hand.
Already?
He winced.
Already talked it over with the captain.
Eva took over.
We're moving back to the ridgeline. Raj is staying behind.
Sebastian shook his head.
But what about the—
Seb, stop.
Raj interrupted.
I'll be dead weight, and you know it.
Sebastian stood and stared at Raj, then spoke, flat and cold.
Moving to security.
Eva opened the communication link through her HUD. The radiation from the geyser had dissipated, no longer scrambling long-range communique. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that the broadband signal would be easily detected by the approaching Covenant forces. But with her Mjolnir crippled and Raj mortally injured, she was at the end of her rope. She made the final call to abandon the mission, then selected SATCOM from the list of available channels. Luckily for them, Oni stationed a stealth-capable mobile command center in orbit around Kolo to provide support and monitor progress. At first, Eva despised the added stress of a watchful eye, but now she was thankful for their presence.
Command, this is Sierra 033 requesting emergency evac at Rally Point Delta.
A steady, calm voice responded.
Sierra 033 acknowledged. Sending a bird down for extraction at Rally Point Delta.
Copy,
Eva replied, before looking back to Raj.
Coveys will be here shortly.
Eva could hear a smile in Raj's voice.
And I'll give them a warm welcome when they arrive.
Captain, we gotta move,
Sebastian remarked over team comm.
Now.
Eva took a final look at Raj. They had been through so much together over their years of service. During the final stages of their training and augmentations, the 3 Spartans were pulled away from the program, labeled as washouts, and thrust into secrecy, working under the Office of Naval Intelligence. Most people within the UNSC, and even their fellow Spartan twos, were unaware of the team's existence. Eva, Raj, and Sebastian had no one but each other. To them, they were a family. She stood at attention and gave Raj a formal salute. Raj tried to return the gesture, arm trembling, but was unable to move more than a few centimeters.
Don't let them win,
he said shakily.
We won't,
Eva replied softly. She started towards Sebastian, who had his suppressed SRS-99 AM sniper fixed in the direction of the encroaching enemy.
Rally Point Delta, let's move.
The 2 Spartans were swift and silent, not exchanging a word as they moved toward the extraction site. They had both experienced loss before. That was the nature of war. But a loss this close to home was unfamiliar and cut them deeply. even if their demeanor didn't show it. They reached the bottom of the cliff leading to the ridge and began to climb. Halfway to the top, a thunderous boom echoed in the distance. They both turned to look as orange and white light filled their visors. The remnants of a shockwave disturbed the fog below them, like a rock thrown into a pond. Smoke billowed from where they left Raj. He had completed the fail-safe protocol. He, along with most, if not all, of the Covenant squads were reduced to ash from the small-scale nuclear detonation. They continued upward, climbing the cliff face as fast as they could. Just before reaching the top, the pilot of their evac craft spoke over their team comm channel.
Approaching Rally Point Delta,
She said.
Coming in on a hot approach.
Copy.
Ava responded.
We're here.
The Pelican roared as it broke through the clouds on a rapid descent toward them. Ava grabbed a signal flare from a supply pouch on her torso, lit its tip, and threw it toward the cliff face opposite to them. The smoke from the flare grew outward and surrounded them in a red fog. As it spread, Sebastian noticed a haze that rippled and unnaturally disturbed the smoke.
Contacts!
He yelled, whipping his sniper up and firing 2 shots at the unknown figure. Both shots made contact, revealing a Sangheli as it slammed to the ground. Ava raised her rifle, quickly scanning in all directions. The smoke shifted back and forth as the enemy, cloaked in active camouflage, attempted evasion. One leapt out at her, its energy sword crackling as it unsheathed. She fired 2 bursts in short succession, weakening the alien's shields before ducking the swipe of its sword. She reared back and punched its torso with all her might, then leapt to deliver a knee directly to its 4-jawed mandible. Its shields popped as it collapsed, and she shot another burst into its head to finish it off. The Pelican maneuvered atop them, its engines clearing the smoke and dust that surrounded them. Sebastian howled in pain. His scream drew Eva's attention away from her rifle's sights. She turned to see him locked in combat with 2 Sangheli. He stomped his boot into one's knee, then jammed his combat knife into its neck. The other reacted, immediately thrusting its sword into Sebastian's back. The force of the strike lifted him off of the ground as he howled in pain.
No!
Ava screamed. She ran at them, expending her magazine into the sword-wielding alien before ramming her shoulder into it at full speed. It flew off the cliff, grasping at air as it dropped out of sight. She grabbed Sebastian by his wrist and pulled him towards the Pelican. The remaining aliens continued their assault, sprinting toward Eva as she dragged her squadmate into the drop hatch. Her Mjolnir creaked as she pulled the AIE 486H heavy machine gun from its mounting point above her head. It spooled, and she began firing. Purple mist erupted from the closest Sangheli, the gun's 51mm armor piercing rounds, sawing it in half.
All units aboard.
Ava barked.
Go!
The Pelican rose, and Eva continued her onslaught, hitting as many of the aliens as she could before the Pelican's thrusters engaged, jarring her body forward. Once through the clouds, Eva mounted the chain gun to the ceiling and closed the drop hatch. She turned and stared at Sebastian, his body motionless, lying on the floor. She couldn't believe it, but her Mjolnir's HUD confirmed. He was gone. A flood of anger washed over her. She turned and slammed her fist against the Pelican's bulkhead. Her inability to protect her team, her brothers. She couldn't bear the shame. She knelt and clutched Sebastian's hand in hers.
I'm sorry.
She said quietly, squeezing his hand tighter.
I'm so sorry.
Chapter 10. Location: Planetary Atmosphere, Colo, Equinox System. Date: June 15th, 2555. If it weren't for the droning sound of the Pelican's engines, Eva could have heard a grenade pin hit the floor. Although she often thought of her old squad mates, she hardly ever spoke of them. Ed and Sarah sat silently, helmets masking their unease. After hearing what had happened, they struggled to find words to say.
I'm sorry.
Sarah said softly.
We didn't know.
No one does.
Eva replied.
Oni doesn't exactly televise Spartan deaths.
Ed scoffed.
Spartans never die. We know what that's like.
Eva stood and grabbed the nearest cargo rack for support.
Colo is deceivingly calm on its surface. Don't think for a second that you can let your guard down.
The memory of a mortally wounded Raj flashed in her mind. She clenched her fist.
We watch each other's backs.
The Pelican jolted, vibrating through the remainder of Kolo's atmosphere. Gravity's pull strengthened as they approached the surface, followed by a series of metallic thunks as Flight Officer Riley spoke through Team Comm.
Drones away. Engaging active camouflage.
Though unnoticeable from the interior of the ship, the Pelican's appearance warped and rippled before becoming almost entirely invisible. Riley adjusted the ship's nose and continued their descent through the thick layer of clouds.
Proceeding to drop zone.
Riley said.
Ready up, Spartans.
Ava moved aft, grabbed the standard-issue SRS-99AM sniper rifle off of the bulkhead, and slapped the drop hatch switch. The door lowered while Ed and Sarah followed suit, each mounting an M392 DMR to their back and performing routine pre-deployment gear checks. A streak of starlight peeked over the horizon, beaming to a spot on the surface between the new growth and old decay. In short time, more columns of light would pierce the clouds like spotlights overhead. Riley flipped the troop bay light to green.
Clear for deployment.
The Pelican spun and hovered meters from the ground, and each Spartan stepped out with a heavy thud.
Recon Alpha away.
As the Pelican flew away and the dust settled, Ava noticed a shimmer out of the corner of her eye. She turned and saw one of Kolo's many lakes gently rippling with the breeze. Its peaceful allure pulled her towards an embankment at the water's edge. Her breath deepened as she looked out to the picturesque horizon.
Cap,
Ed said, approaching Ava from behind.
You good?
She snapped from her daze.
I'm fine.
Ed looked to Sarah, who responded with a shrug.
I promise.
Ava said firmly.
The coordinates are a few clicks south. Let's move out.
The Spartans set off into the forest, maneuvering through densely packed dead trees to avoid ever-shifting pillars of light. The snaps of brush underfoot became a numbing rhythm as they crept, until they encountered a trailhead. Ava took point up the passageway, stopping just shy of an opening in the surrounding stone.
You two hold position here.
Ava ordered. She mounted her rifle to her back and continued up the trail. The emerging view of the valley below slowly revealed the target of their search. A large structure built into the side of a cliff sat surrounded by support equipment and a sizable hydropower facility. Red and gray plating veiled the subtle curves of the underlying Covenant architecture, making it clear that the occupying force repurposed an outpost from the recently collapsed alien alliance. Ava shouldered her sniper and peered through its scope. Its enhanced zoom gave her a clear visual of the activity around the base. She pulled a cable from the rifle's scope and inserted it into a port on the back of her helmet.
Recording visual?
She noted. The place was bustling with activity. Ungoi, the aliens known as grunts, hauled crates as Kigyar patrolled the perimeter. A group of 3 Jiralhani watched over them with weapons drawn, their armor shining in the morning sun. One wore blood-red plating and had a massive gravity hammer slung over its shoulder, clearly their leader. Suddenly a low hum reverberated through the forest.
Looks like they have visitors,
Sarah said, while a ship whizzed by, overhead.
That's an old Covey Phantom by the look of it,
Ed added.
Affirmative.
Eva confirmed.
In pretty bad shape, too.
She watched the ship clumsily descend into the compound and hover in place before a narrow, transparent beam shot to the ground from its underbelly. 2 figures followed shortly after, floating steadily until their feet touched the facility's metal-plated floor. Ava's gaze narrowed as she adjusted her scope's focus. One of the figures strode ahead of the other with a calm posture and a gait all too familiar.
Humans,
Ava said plainly. Ed's voice crackled over Team Comm.
Come again?
The lead figure approached the Jiralhani, and the group began to chat.
They're human,
she responded.
I'm calling it in.
She lowered her rifle and scrolled through comm channels on her HUD. She selected the encrypted channel that Osman had provided, cleared her throat, and waited for a response.
Yes, Captain?
Admiral Osman said through static.
We've discovered the supplier's facilities,
Ava said.
And 2 humans just arrived in a Phantom.
Any ID?
Osman asked.
Negative, ma'am.
Osman took a breath.
Curious. Proceed with stage 2, but be cautious. We don't want to light the fuse until we know who those people are.
The fuse referred to by Osman were a series of tactical airstrikes executed by the same drones deployed during their entry to Kolo. All Recon Alpha needed to do was mark the targets, but not before gathering any intelligence they could. She continued,
Information is power, Spartan. If I only wanted the place blown up, I'd have sent someone else. Good luck.
Ava closed the channel and looked back through her optics. There was no way to know at this distance who the humans were.
Let's get a closer look,
she said. After a treacherous descent from the ridgeline, the Spartans approached a fence that barred entry into the base. It wasn't overly tall, probably 4 meters or so, lined with massive spikes that gave it an imposing silhouette. By the time they had gotten close enough, both the Jiralhanai and the humans had moved into the base. The added complexity troubled Ava. They quickly identified a gap in the fence's construction, just large enough for a full set of Mjolnir to slip through.
Here's the plan,
Ava said, pointing to the gap.
We infiltrate, mark the fire zones, then push into the base for intel.
Ed shook his head.
No way we'll have time for both. Not if we stick together.
We're not splitting up,
Ava said firmly. Sarah stepped in, her voice quiet, but steady.
We'll make it work. Trust us.
Ava hesitated, weighing the risks and second-guessing her instincts. She nodded.
All right, but we do this my way.
She quickly devised a plan. Ed and Sarah would snake their way through the sparse structures beyond the fence, marking targets as they go. Meanwhile, Ava would gain entry to the base through one of the discharge pipes protruding from the cliff side.
If this goes bad, you get out,
Ava said.
Yes, ma'am.
Ed and Sarah said together. Ava took a deep breath and started away from her squad mates. She watched as their darkened shapes slipped through the fence and disappeared into the base. They were on their own now. She began her ascent up the jagged cliffside, trying her best to keep a low profile with daylight steadily emerging from behind the mountains. The roar of rushing water grew louder as she approached the discharge pipe. Warm water gushed out with relentless force, speckling her visor with water droplets. She reached up, grabbed the lip of the pipe, and crawled inside. Ava's Mjolnir compensated for the immense force of the stream, engaging her boots' magnetic soles for increased stability. Even still, each movement was grueling, but she pressed forward, inch by inch. A sudden notice appeared on her HUD, warning her of her armor's rising internal temperatures. This prompted the undersuit's liquid cooling system to engage. A faint chill coursed over her skin, giving her the morale boost she needed to reach the end of the pipe. After dislodging a rusted grate, she slipped out into what seemed to be a large water reservoir. Putting one hand over the other, she crawled carefully to its surface. The chamber was vast, filled with the steady hum of machinery. Her eyes quickly locked onto a power generator dominating the space, and for a moment, she considered the possibility of destroying it. A carefully placed explosive would cripple the base's operations, but with it buried inside the cliff, an airstrike may not be enough. She filed the thought away and shifted her focus back to her priority directive. Ava moved silently through corridors and passageways, evading detection by the scattered patrols of Kigyar and Ungoy. As she approached the next corner, she heard alien chatter reverberating off of the walls. The sound grew louder as Ava unsheathed her combat knife. A pair, one Kigyar and one Ungoy, wandered down the hall and around the corner. She struck swiftly, jabbing her blade into the skull of the Ungoy before grabbing her sidearm and shoving it into the beak of the Kigyar. It choked out a squawk just before Ava pulled the trigger, splattering purple mist and chunks of bone against the wall. The halls fell silent once again. At that moment, Ed's voice broke through the team comm channel.
Most of the tags are out. We ran into some resistance, nothing we couldn't handle. Proceeding as planned.
Copy that,
Ava replied, her voice steady despite the tension mounting in her chest.
Keep going. I'll check in when I have something.
She navigated deeper into the base, entering a poorly lit room filled with stacked crates that towered over her. Each crate had a painted logo and emitted a dull red glow that illuminated the gathering dust in the air. As she moved to inspect one of the crate's contents, a door on the far side of the room hissed open. She instinctively dove behind a stack of crates and readied her sniper. It wasn't the ideal close-quarters weapon, but it would deliver one hell of a punch. Peering through a narrow gap between crates, she saw the hulking brute leader she'd been tracking, flanked by its human collaborators. The dim lighting overhead provided enough information for her helmet's vision sensors, giving Ava a clear look at the targets. Her blood ran cold when her gaze settled on one of the human faces, the rebel general from Ixion, Sherwin Fitch. Chapter 11. Location: Banished Facility, Colo, Equinox System. Date: June 15th, 2555. Ava crouched in the shadows, evaluating the situation. Admiral Osman assured her Fitch wouldn't be a problem. But here he was, and if he had made it this deep into the Covenant remnants, he may be more of a threat than ever. She secured her sniper to her back, drawing her sidearm in its place. The hammer-wielding Jiralhanai lumbered further into the room, his armor plating clacking with each step. He turned to face Fitch and gestured at the crates.
"I have much to offer, human,"
the Jiralhanai growled.
"but I'm more concerned with what you have to offer me."
Fitch crossed his arms. His posture feigned confidence.
Depends. How much does it cost?
"I told you, I don't need your useless tokens."
The Jiralhanai leaned closer.
"I want your loyalty to us, to the Banished."
Banished,
Eva thought to herself. She'd heard rumors, fringe skirmishes against UNSC forces, but nothing hinted at this level of organization. Eva had just stepped into something larger and more complicated than she'd anticipated. Her thoughts halted as Sarah chimed through Team Comm.
"Captain, we've been compromised,"
she said shakily.
"Evading enemy contact for now, but I'm not sure."
The line cut out abruptly, replaced with static. Whatever she was dealing with, it didn't sound good. And if the team was truly in danger, then there was no time to strategize. She vaulted over her cover, sprinting straight for Fitch and the massive alien. Both of them turned immediately, stunned at her presence. Fitch's confidant darted for the exit, and before the other two could react, Eva sent a round straight through Fitch's right leg. He collapsed to the floor, howling in pain as Eva shifted her attention to the Jiralhanai, who had unsheathed and readied his gravity hammer. She shifted her aim and fired, her bullets striking the gaps in its armor. 2 shots broke into its fur-covered skin, while the others ricocheted harmlessly. The undeterred Jiralhanai reared back with a roar before swinging all its might downward at Eva. She stopped, shifted her weight, and dashed, narrowly avoiding the devastating blow that blew apart the floor where she stood. In one fluid motion, she unsheathed her combat knife and leapt at her opponent, her sidearm barking as she emptied its magazine. The beast lunged again, delivering a powerful punch to Eva's torso. The strike broke her shields and sent her flying across the room. She grunted as she impacted a nearby crate and slammed to the floor.
"Tags are set,"
Ed blurted over Team Comm.
"but we've been engaged."
Eva winced, pain lancing through her ribs. It was happening all over again, her team on the brink, and her powerless to stop it. But she wasn't going to let history repeat itself. The Jiralhanai let out another roar and sprinted at her, his hammer spitting sparks as he dragged it across the floor. Eva immediately reached for the sniper still mounted to her Mjolnir's backplate, swung it over her shoulder, and pulled the trigger, using only her bare eyes to line up the shot. The bullet flew straight into the opening on the Jiralhanai's faceplate and pinged as it struck the interior of its helmet. The moment its body thumped to the floor, a thunderous boom echoed outside of the facility. Eva rushed to Fitch with her sniper fixed in his direction. His gaze locked to hers as his hands rose into the air.
"You gonna kill me, Spartan?"
he asked. Eva switched to external speakers.
Not yet.
Another boom sounded outside of the base.
"You're not here for me."
Fitch gestured to the crates.
"You're here for all of this."
Eva didn't respond, and instead toggled her comms.
Recon Alpha, how copy?
"Bad,"
Sarah replied, voice strained.
"We've barricaded ourselves in a guard tower. We're almost out of ammo."
Gunfire and detonations punctuated her words.
How confident are you in the structural integrity of that guard tower?
Eva asked.
"Whatever you're thinking, do it,"
Ed yelled.
"because the alternative isn't an option."
Eva took a breath, her mind racing.
"Well, what is it going to be?"
Fitch asked. She switched her comm channel to SATCOM.
Alpha leader to Sat-1, tags are set. I repeat, tags are set. Fire away.
Within moments, the booms were replaced by a barrage of detonations that shook the entire facility. Chunks of stone and sheet metal began to fall around them. The walls began to shift and warp until they gave way, pouring a mass of rock and sediment into the room. An eerie calm befell the area. What were once doorways had now become walls of debris, blocking all obvious exits. Eva pulled Fitch to a clearing in the middle of the room and began to pat him down.
"I'm not armed,"
he said.
The brutes didn't think it wise to let me carry a gun around.
Ava ignored him and continued, her search yielding a long-range communicator and a small data chip. She briefly inspected both before placing them into a hard case on her belt. Her gaze then shifted to toppled-over crates nearby. Among the mess, a hollow table blinked faintly with residual power. Ava stepped over, pushing the crates aside to access its terminal. She connected her helmet interface. Lines of alien symbols scrolled across her visor as she copied everything she could to her Mjolnir's onboard storage. The transfer completed with a small chime.
Recon Alpha status,
She said through team comm.
You don't even know what you're looking for,
Fitch said. Eva tried her team again.
Recon Alpha status.
Ed's voice came through, coughing.
I can't believe that worked.
Eva breathed a sigh of relief. He continued.
We're pretty banged up, but alive. What about you?
Trapped for now, but I think I've got a way out,
She said, her gaze landing on a large grate mounted to the wall.
Regroup at Rally Point Zulu.
Ava looked back to Fitch, who was tightening a tourniquet around his upper thigh. He had managed to stop the bleeding, but without proper aid, his chances were slim. She stepped closer to him and stared, weighing her options. No one else knew she'd found Fitch. Her mission was technically complete, yet she had an opportunity to go further, to eliminate a critical piece of Ixion's resistance. Her hand drifted to her sidearm. Fitch scowled.
There you are. That's the kind of Spartan I know.
Eva lifted the pistol, hovering its barrel centimeters from his face.
No remorse, no regard. Utterly inhuman.
Eva's breath caught as Lieutenant Dahlgren's words resurfaced in her mind.
You can choose, you know that, right?
At the time she dismissed Dahlgren's remark as naive and disloyal, but now his words carried a newfound weight that struck a chord in Eva's psyche.
Do it!
Fitch yelled. Eva's grip on the weapon tightened, then relaxed as she slowly lowered the pistol. Without a word, she retrieved the long-range communicator from her hard case and tossed it toward him.
What?
Fitch muttered, confused. Eva turned without answering, her gaze already fixed on the grate above. She leapt from crate to boulder, launching herself at the opening. Her fingers caught the edge, and she hauled herself inside. As she pressed forward, she reached a bend that revealed a distant prick of light. Eva adjusted her HUD as she emerged into the open air. A waypoint for Rally Point Zulu blinked in the corner of her eye, and she set off toward it. Ed and Sarah were already there, huddled behind a rocky outcrop. Sarah's arm was hastily bandaged, and Ed's armor was covered in scorch marks.
Took you long enough,
Ed said with an audible grin.
Sorry to keep you waiting,
Ava replied, helping Sarah to her feet. There was a roar in the distance, and Flight Officer Riley's voice broke through team comm.
Alpha 1 to Alpha Leader, coming in hot.
The Pelican swooped low, its engines kicking up dust and debris.
Get aboard, Spartans.
Copy that,
Ava said as she ushered her team onto the dropship. Ed and Sarah slumped against the walls, their exhaustion palpable. Riley glanced back from the cockpit.
Rough day?
He asked. Ava stared out the viewport as the crumbled banished facility shrank beneath them. Her mind replayed the last few hours, the weight of Dahlgren's words, the choices she'd made, and the unsettling realization that she wasn't as unshakable as she once was.
I've had better.
The Pelican broke through Kolo's atmosphere into the cold, unfeeling backdrop of space. Ava had completed her mission, but the cracks in her armor were impossible to ignore, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could repair them.